Snow came in thin skins on the stones, not yet the deep drifts that turned the courtyards into muted plains, but a dusting that softened the hard lines of Winterfell without stealing any of its strength. The hot springs breathed their patient mist through cracks and vents, and the breath of the castle rose like a slow animal's sigh against the gray morning. Jon stood in the godswood before the heart tree, where the face cut in the pale trunk looked down with that familiar, unreadable sorrow. Ghost moved in the hush with him, light where the snow was darker, silent where the wind did speak, and the red leaves stirred like a held breath. He had not slept. His thoughts had gone round and round all night, and the knot of them had not loosened but settled, hard and certain. A raven had woken in some tower at false dawn, croaking complaint, and another answered, and the young wolves in the kennels had set to a brief restless yip before the kennel master hissed them down. The world's sounds were small here beneath the carved eyes of the old gods. Even his own breath seemed immodest. He had come to say goodbye to the heart tree, he told himself. He had come to fix in memory the exact way the scarlet leaves looked with frost on their edges, how the hot water off the spring creek curled the air at his feet with the smell of iron and earth. He had come because he had told Robb he would ride north with Jon Stark when the king left, and sometimes the only way to make a thing real is to set yourself before gods and feel the day take you. But he had not come to say goodbye after all. The wind lifted and laid a few leaves from the elm into the pool, and they carried, turning, to the outflow. Ghost watched them. He liked the floating of small things, the passage of them. Jon knelt and put his hand to the damp root where the ground bulged, and he felt the cold, and then the warmth of the spring below, and then he felt that settled thing in his chest again, the iron sense that if he went, he would be a man in black among strangers, a sword whose hilt no one trusted to keep by the hearth. It was a fate he had accepted as long as he could remember. A place for a bastard, the blank promise of an oath to make his blood no longer matter. He could picture himself, a dark figure on a white ridge, the wind like a blade across the teeth, and a different heart tree in a wood where the snow ate the sound of your steps. That had always sounded like a kind of peace. But that picture had shifted, and there was a hollow in the middle of it now where Robb should be, where a brother's voice should be when he buckled on a coat of mail, where a hand should clap his shoulder and a laugh should come, and where the laugh had been he heard instead the scrape of his own breath. Bran lay upstairs in a bed that steamed faintly through the hours when the fires dipped. His small hands were as warm as a saved ember and as slack as water's skin. Catelyn's vigil had drawn the house into a new gravity. People walked quieter and looked at their boots more and did not laugh in the kitchens unless they forgot themselves. Arya had curled up on a settle near Bran's door until the old woman chased her to bed. Sansa sat straight and practiced patience while her needle made reluctant, perfect seams. The house rearranged itself around worry, and Winterfell as Jon knew it had shifted, and he could not leave it to settle without him. He had not known that was true until the night, when Robb had come to him with a face too carefully composed not to be transparent. They had gone walking along the inner wall until the torches burned low. Robb had laid out all the things he would have to do and was doing already. He had sat the high seat while their father saw to the king. He had signed his name to the orders Luwin had drafted. He had looked men in the eye and told them to do tasks they had done for years and seen the difference in them as they heard it from him. He had kept his voice from breaking when he sent smaller matters to the stewards, and his hands had been steady when he fed Bran a spoon of meat broth that had gone cold while he spoke to Hullen about the horses that would travel south. He looked at me the way men look at a boy trying on a man's boots, Robb had said with half a smile that did not hold. And then, later, the same man comes back, and he puts down his cup, and he says, "My lord." And his voice means it, and all at once the boots fit and I can feel every stone through the sole. I do not know if they fit because he said it, or because I said all the words Luwin taught me, or because there is no one else to put them on for now. "And you think I would make the boots feel less of a stone?" Jon had said, not altogether joking. "I think you would tell me when I am about to step in horse dung," Robb had said, and that had made him laugh, which had turned into something else almost at once. They had walked the length of the wall again. Jon had thought of Benjen's promise. A different home, a brotherhood that would take his blood and press it into theirs until they all were something else. And he had thought of the faces in the courtyard that day when the king arrived, The way Robb had turned his head to him without thinking, to share the sight, to say with a look that's mine to carry and yours to witness. And we carry it because we were born on the same stones and ran the same passages and split the same crust on the same pie stolen from the same window ledge. It was not a thought that fit well into words. It had the weight of lived for years, and it ended in no declarative sentence that would satisfy Maester Luwin. But he could not deny it. So he had come to the godswood to tell the old gods what he had not told Benjen Stark yet. No, not the wall, not now. He would put on no black cloak. He would not swear away a place that was not his and yet had been home. He would stand for Robb and with Robb, and he would carry Robb's burdens where he could, and he would do it knowingly, accepting that in Catelyn's eyes it would be presumption added to presumption. He would find a way to be necessary, so that necessity could excuse the shape of his shadow in the halls she wanted to see clear of it. Ghost came and pressed his shoulder against Jon's knee. Jon touched the wolf between the ears and Ghost blinked, slow and pale as snow caught on ice. "You'll stay too, then?" Jon said under his breath, and the heart tree, which had never answered him, looked as if it had heard. The bell for the lower yard practice sounded once, a low rhymed clang, and the world's small noises woke fully. Jon rose, knees damp, and left the curl of spring steam and the red eyes fixed regard. He took a path not many knew, where you had to sidestep a split in the paving stones and the moss made the footing treacherous. He had learned it in a summer when there had been no need for shortcuts, and yet they had made a game of finding them. Robb would be at the yard. If not, he'd be with Luwin. He would not be in Bran's room. That vigil was for Catelyn, and for the quiet of breath and flame. On the way he passed a scullion in a red-cheeked hurry with a basket of parsnips and 2 onions atop like a crown. The boy stumbled a step, and Jon steadied the basket by instinct. "Thank you, Em." The boy began and then swallowed the rest, not sure what to call him, and ran on. The word snagged, and it did not. Jon knew he would be stepping around that sort of hesitation for years. Jory Castle nodded to him with a soldier's kindness at the barbican. "You'll be wanting the yard, then, Jon?" "Aye," Jon said. "He's there. Been there an hour and more." Robb liked early practice before his mind filled with letters and lists. Jon did too, though he had not slept. He went down the steps and the clangor of steel rose to meet him, bright and honest. The air tasted of iron and leather and a little of wood smoke. Robb was sparring with Hallis Mullen, whose heavy shoulders made every practice blade look underfed in his hands. Sweat ran down Robb's neck into the fur collar of his cloak, and the breath ghosted before Hallis's mouth in quick bursts. When Robb saw Jon, he almost dropped his guard and then remembered himself, and Jon felt pride as clean as the winter sun. They fought for 3 exchanges more, and Hallis parried Robb's last thrust and made him pay for overreaching with a ringing tap to the ribs. Robb took it without complaint. He had learned to keep his face from showing insult when he was shown his errors, in that he was already more of a lord than most men ever manage. "Again," Robb said, and Hallis shook his head. "I promised Luwin you'd have your hands for writing before midday, my lord. Maester Luwin is too strong for me by far," Robb said, bending to take up his discarded glove. "We best not cross him when he has ink as a weapon." He looked to Jon. It was a small thing, but it was constant. When Robb looked for a place to set his mind, he looked at Jon as if there were a hook there strong enough to hold. "You look as if you haven't slept," Robb said, knowing the answer. "I haven't," Jon said. He did not say why. He would say it once he had said it to the right ears. A decision that large belongs first to those who must live with it. Robb frowned slightly, as if it cost him not to pry. He could be gentle when it mattered. He could be fierce when it was asked, and between those poles he was a river over stones. "Walk with me," he said, and Hallis grunted something respectful that could have been a blessing or a curse for youth wasted on duty. They left the ring and moved along the yard where 2 boys from the kitchens were knocking the dust out of rugs with a switch and laughing under their breath until they remembered where they were. The laughter thinned to a thread and then died. The corner where the kennel walls made a good sun trap held a watchful huddle of hounds. The smithy belled and hissed. The quarrelers mended fletching with their mouths full of dyed feathers. Winterfell's ordinary life, altered by worry but not extinguished, went on. They stopped when they came within sight of the tower that held Bran's room. It had begun to feel like a different keep altogether, that tower, known and yet not to be entered by everyone anymore, as if sorrow had a limit to how many eyes it could bear. 2 guards stood before its door. One had his helm pushed back and his ears red from the cold. He straightened when he saw Robb and then remembered Jon beside him and pretended he had straightened long ago. "I came to say," Jon said, voice even with effort, "that I won't be riding north with Uncle." Robb's breath made a small cloud. "You won't," he said, and did not even dress it as a question. There was the flicker of surprise and then an expression that was not quite relief, not quite worry, but both. "Tell me you came to that without thinking I asked it of you." "You didn't ask," Jon said. "I did not ask," Robb said. "If I had wanted to be noble about it, I would have told you that the wall is a good calling and suits your nature and you should go. I would have rehearsed all the reasons and grown eloquent and been very virtuous. I sat last night composing those words and did not speak them. I suppose that is the kind of sin a septon would have a name for." "It's a northern sin," Jon said, and when Robb smiled he felt the weight in his chest lift a little. "She won't like it?" Robb said after a time, looking at the tower door, which might as well have been Catelyn herself at that moment. "No," Jon said. "She won't. We will make her dislike count for less by doing too much to be spared." "You always had a way of making simple sentences sound like orders," Robb said, amused and grateful both. "I should have known you'd do this." "I didn't know until this morning," Jon said, and that was true in the way of truths that come little by little and at once. "There are things to be done. If this house is to be pulled around by the king's visit and our father's leaving and Bran's sickness, we must be the ones with our hands on the rope. You'll have to be my voice with those who will not look me straight in the face yet," Robb said. "Some of them still see a boy when they look at me, and some of them see a lord and are afraid to say the first things that come to mind. I need someone who knows how to look at the same ledger twice and tell me why the numbers sing a different song each time." "You ask for a steward," Jon said. "I ask for a right hand," Robb said, and the words were only words and yet they made the cold and the sound of the smithy and the hounds all stand at a different angle. Jon breathed out. He had not expected to feel gratitude like warmth, but there it was. "Then I'll be that." They stood for a small time as if the agreement had to settle into the stones. Ghost came up and sniffed at Robb's glove and licked the edge of the leather, and Robb rubbed the smooth line of the wolf's skull between ear and eye, and Ghost closed his eyes as if in benediction, accepting the pact like a third brother. "Come," Robb said finally. "Luwin will want to write a new list," and he could not keep the laughter from his voice. Maester Luwin's turret smelled of vellum and dust and the little oil he used to keep his desk from warping as the seasons breathed on it. The maester's chain glinted in the low light. His hair was sparse and intent. He had a way of taking up space that never felt like an imposition, exactly. He had learned to be present among lords who shifted around him without being remembered for the shifting. He looked up when they entered, and his gaze flickered over Jon, and then away and back, quick, curious, measuring, and kind. "My lords," he said by habit, because names and titles were the tools he set in order each morning, and then Jon, because that too he had learned. "We have decided," Robb said. "I have decided. Jon will remain at Winterfell." Luwin held still a heartbeat, and Jon saw the calculations change in his eyes the way a chessboard's peril rearranges in a clever mind. "I see," the maester said. He adjusted the order of the papers on the desk as if his hands needed to enact the same shifting. "Then we alter the load a little." "We alter it a great deal," Robb said. "Only tell me where to push." Luwin's smile was the faintest thing. "If the gods grant me any comfort in my old age, it will be hearing that question more often than the one men usually ask." He pushed forward a slate on which figures in chalk were laid out in neat columns. "We have grain enough for the season and the next if nothing goes wrong and if we are careful. We have salted meat enough for the Lord's progress and the retinue's leaving. We have quarrels enough provided no one forgets the heads and the Fletchers are not called south. The stables will need extra hands once we receive the spare horses from the outlying keeps. I sent word yesterday. The accounts for the mending of the inner curtain wall are not as I wish them to be, but stonework has its own pace. If you will be here, Jon, you might put your eye to the carpenter stock and the north gate hinges. They have been groaning like old men, and the resin is nearly gone. We will need the supplier out of Barrowton to send more, and not the cheap mix he tried last spring. I can see to the hinges this afternoon, Jon said. Ghost will help by not swallowing any nails, Luwin said gravely to the wolf, and Ghost blinked, unimpressed by human humor. Also, Luwin said, laying another paper near the first, it is prudent to consider messages. If Lord Eddard rides south within the King's train, there will be decisions to which he would have answers proper to Winterfell. We cannot send him a messenger every time a goat breaks a fence. For that there is you, Robb. But there will be matters where a word from him should be had, and a swift raven will serve. Jon has a steady hand. He may help me manage the rookery. It will do no harm to set 2 pairs of eyes to the tags and the cords. Robb had started to pace. He was at his ease when moving. I want the men to see him at my side, he said, as if the words were both instruction to Luwin and vow to himself. Not at my back, not around a corner. I want them to come to him when they cannot reach me, and to know that it is the same as bringing it to me. Then you must be seen with him in places where you are not, strictly speaking, required to be, Luwin said. The lower yard, the kitchens, the counting house. You must be seen to listen, and, if I may say, you must be seen to disagree. If he says A and you say B, it should not look as if the breath is caught in your throat and you will die of it. Men will take their cue from your ease. Robb nodded, absorbing it like sun warms a stone. He had always been good at learning how to carry what came without losing the shape of himself. Jon, who often bent, felt more brittle by nature. He used his stiffness like a staff. It kept him upright even when it made him strike. One thing more, Luwin said, and now his look included Jon particularly. Lady Catelyn. I know, Jon said before he could think to be wise. I will not sit where she must see me when she looks for air. That is not precisely how I would have put it, Luwin said, with that thin-sliced humor that allowed no laughter and yet permitted breath. But yes, to walk gently is best. The house is hers to command where the Lord is absent, and grief is a force that often forgets its corridors. It will help to be useful in rooms she does not choose to enter. I will start with hinges, Jon said. He found his mouth had gone dry. He had always known the plainness of Catelyn's dislike. It had a right to exist. It was a boundary he had learned as one learns to step over a low wall without disturbing the stones. But to accept it as an element of work, to plan around it as a mason plans around a boulder that cannot be moved, that was different. It made his decision feel heavier and more deliberate. Robb touched the edge of the desk. And letters. Several, Luwin said, with satisfaction that was mostly about the tidiness of lists. Lord Wyman at White Harbor, for one. The king's visit did not go unwitnessed by the Manderley men, and we shall need to quiet the harbor's gossip. Lord Karstark for another, and Lord Umber. Both will want assurances about the training of the men and the provisions for the winter. The glass garden repair is not finished. The south end leaks heat like a sieve. Write to Osha in the greenhouses and ask her which stones she needs set, and then draft a letter to Master Tobo's apprentice in White Harbor. He handles the glassware and will complain eloquently if the heat continues to ruin his jars. We will do that, Robb said, and something in his shoulders settled. Come, Jon. If we must be seen to listen and disagree both, let us start by seeing. They left the turret with a list in Robb's hand and a weight in Jon's pocket. The small iron key to the north gate hinges that Hullen had once pressed into his palm as if passing a secret. The stairs down from the rookery were steep and narrow, and the wind cut across the highest stair like a clever thief. Jon reached out to steady Robb without thinking when his boot slid a fraction, and Robb took the hand without the pretense of not needing it. There was no ceremony to the small axe that made a house stand. They were always the same size, repeated until the stones themselves remembered the rhythm. In the stable yard, Hullen was arguing with a groom about a cob that had thrown a shoe. and when he saw Robb, he finished his sentence anyway. It was a good sign. The men were beginning to remember that a lord's presence did not mean the death of their thought mid-flight. "There's that twist in the foreleg again," Hullen said by way of greeting, gruff, efficient. "I told them not to run him on the packed path. They'll do it anyway when my back's turned. My lord, we'll set the shoe and keep him to the softer passes," Robb said. He looked to Jon. "The north gate hinges?" "Hinges," Jon said, and Hullen grunted. Approval, perhaps, or irritation at hinges, or both. The cob blew warm grass breath at Jon's sleeve and nosed the pocket where he sometimes kept salt. Ghost, who did not like the smell of horses, stood a little apart and watched the world. The north gate had been complaining for months. In summer it was only a mutter, but with the frost the old tar had stiffened and the iron moaned when the gate swung. The sound traveled up into the stones, which echoed it, magnifying it into the bellow of some tired thing. Jon fetched the iron kettle of water and set it over a brazier near the first hinge, and the steam did the patient work that men too often try to hurry. He cracked the old resin with a pick, gentle as a groom combing a mane with his fingers. He moved well when his hands were busy. Thought flowed easier along the path of a task. Robb stood with him, not to command but to accompany. "Do you remember the first time we tried to lift this with no tools and only pride?" Robb said after a time. "You nearly took your foot off," Jon said. "You nearly took my foot off," Robb corrected. "We accomplished something important," Jon said. "We learned to pretend it was the gate's fault and not ours." Robb's laugh was brief, clean. He bent to hold the hinge steady while Jon covered it again with fresh, warm pitch. Steam rose in a white leaf against the iron. The smell caught in their throats. When they had finished the first, Jon waited for the pitch to set, then eased the hinge on its pins, listening to the way it moved, feeling the stubborn give. It was better. The groan was lower, less like pain, more like a day's work. He clapped the iron with the back of the pick as if to thank it. The gate would not sing like a harp, but it would not be a wounded thing anymore. "Catelyn will not like it," Robb said, when they were halfway through the second hinge and the heat had made his cheeks bright. "I know. It isn't only dislike. She will be afraid of what it means to those who watch. If they see you stand with me, they will call you what they will, and some of those names will not be kind. There are men who will be content to let the fact of your birth be an insult they can pick up and fling when it suits. You are telling me not to flinch when it hits. I am telling you I will not let it hit alone," Robb said. The second hinge came away, and he set it on the cloth as carefully as if it were an object of worship. "A lord's right hand is usually a man with a name that opens doors," Jon said, not complaining, only naming the shape of the thing they were building. "A lord's right hand is the man who keeps the door from falling off its hinges, while the lord learns which rooms to walk into," Robb said. "And when my father returns and I am only a son again, we will have done something boring and necessary, and that will suit me fine." They worked until the ink of pitch dried in smooth bands where the cracks had been, until the iron gave back a low sound like a satisfied animal when they moved it. When Jon stepped back and swung the gate with both palms, the noise it made was honest. Hallis Mullen, who had come to find them to ask some question about rations, stood with his mouth open for the length of one swing, and then shut it. "I won't have to hear that in my sleep no more," he said. "I thank you for it." "You may thank Jon," Robb said, careful to let the words be heard. Hallis nodded to Jon as to a soldier whose deed could be praised without confusion. "Thank you, then." Jon felt the odd heat again, this time not from a brazier but from his chest. He had not made a speech. He had set iron in order. The men would go through this gate 20 times a day and not think to bless the hands that made it smooth, and that too was how a house held. He had chosen work that would be known by its absence of complaint rather than its grandeur. Suited him. They broke bread where the old wall met the kitchen's wall, on a ledge that a broken buttress had made into a narrow bench. Arya found them there, her hair a wild knot sticking out from under a cap that had once been gray and was now the color of that particular dirt only kitchens can teach a cloth. She climbed to sit without asking if she might. There were few places where she asked anything of anyone, and fewer where she waited to be told no. "You have pitch on your face," she said to Jon, delighted. "I have pitch everywhere," Jon said. "You look like a crow fell on you and died," Arya said, and he flicked the end of her cap with a finger. "Where were you supposed to be?" Robb asked, sternness undermined by affection. "Learning stitches," Arya said, and grimaced as if the word tasted sour. "Old Nen says watching Bran sleep looks too much like me when I'm meant to be quiet." "Stitches are useful," Jon said. "A sword will not mend a torn shirt," Robb said, attempting wisdom. "A shirt will not stop a sword," Arya said with implacable logic, biting into a piece of bread so large it could have been a hunk of wall. Jon had meant to give Needle to her the day he left, but he was not leaving today. He had the little blade wrapped in cloth under his bed, where Ghost had sniffed it and sneezed as if insulted by the smell of oil. He would give it to her before the southbound party left. He would do it quietly, and Catelyn would be furious if she knew, and he would bear that, because Arya had a mind that needed sharp edges and a hand that wanted work. "After dinner," Jon said, "come to the place behind the weirwood pool where the stones rise like an old man's knuckles. Bring no one, and try not to step in the mud." "I never step in the mud by accident," Arya said, eyes alight. "It is always on purpose." "When people begin sentences that way," Robb said, "Maester Luwin gets a pain in his temple." "Maester Luwin's temple hurts because he reads too much," Arya said. "He should go out and throw snow at Theon." "Everyone should go out and throw snow at Theon," Robb said solemnly, and somehow the gloom that had lived in the courtyard since Bran fell thinned for a breath, because humor does that. It makes room for air where the body had forgotten it needed to breathe. They ate the rest of their bread in the sun. The light was thin and clear, like water that has been strained of all silt. Ghost lay with his head on Jon's boot, as if to make sure that the boot could not move without him. A serving girl came by with a basket of apples and an expression that said she had been told not to dawdle, and Robb took 3 and tossed one to Arya and one to Jon. The apples were the sort that kept well, tart and sound. He bit into his and the juice ran down his thumb, and for a moment he tasted only that. "There's a man at the outer gate with a cart," Hallis said from behind his shoulder, as if he had always been there and only now remembered to speak. "Says he has tin buckles and cord. Says he has a letter for Luwin. Says he knows you." "Everyone knows us now," Robb said without pleasure. "The king leaves a long shadow." "He said he knew the bastard," Hallis said without malice or emphasis. And then, as if he had heard the word again in his own mouth and did not like it, added, "He said he knew Jon." "Who is he?" Jon asked. "A tinker," Hallis said, "named Dobb. From nowhere with a name anyone remembers." "A tinker is a moving man," Robb said. "He might carry news as easily as he carries buckles. Luwin will want the letter. Will want the cord." "Come, Jon." "Arya, go back to my needle," Arya said, making a face. She scrambled down and ran off with the apple in her hand, as if it were a stone she meant to throw at something larger than herself. At the outer gate, the man called Dobb had the look of those who spend their lives with one eye on the horizon, at ease with waiting, but never altogether at rest. His cart was a small mountain of small things. Kettles that had seen better fires, hinges, lengths of rope, a sack of nails that chimed when he shifted his foot, 2 spools of cord, and a rag-wrapped bundle that might have been a whistle or a knife or a toy, depending on who asked. He saw Robb and bowed his head, but his eyes went to Jon, and he smiled with teeth gone gray in the middle from too much winter bread. "The last time I saw you," he said, "you were a boy who had stolen a pair of mittens from a line and were very sorry you had done it because they scratched." Jon felt foolish and known at once. He had indeed taken a pair of mittens from a washerwoman's line in a winter 5 years past when his fingers had cracked until they bled. He had returned them after a day, ashamed, and the woman had cuffed him without malice and told him to ask next time. The tinker had been there with a kettle that leaked and a mouth that had told 3 jokes and a story that made no sense and left the boys in stitches anyway. "You sold me a tin cup with a dent," Jon said. Dobb made his hands into a bowl and held them out as if to receive the accusation. "And you were kinder to that cup than any lord has been to any cup ever since," he said. "It had a good life with you, and it was large enough to catch snow. There are worse fates." "You said you had a letter," Robb said, courteous, direct. Dobb dug under the spools and brought out a small roll of parchment sealed with a blob of dark wax too crude to be a lord's. He held it as if it were a bird that might decide not to be there anymore. "From a man 2 days' travel west, near the banks by the marsh that eats carts if you let it." He said, "If you go by Winterfell, as you sometimes do, give this to the maester if you can, and if you cannot, can you at least leave it someplace dry?" He paid me with a dried fish and a prayer that I do not belong to his god. So I think the fish was the better of the two. Robb accepted the letter and turned it in his hand. He did not break the seal. He did not need to. "We'll take it to Luwin," he said. "I have cord," Dobb said hopefully. "Fine cord for hanging small things and larger cord for tying the world together when it wants to come apart. I have buckles that will outlast the men who wear the belts. I have a knife that looks like it spent 2 years in the belly of a stubborn fish and came out sharpened by spite. I have." "We'll take the cord," Jon said, before Dobb could make the gatehouse into a stall where all the gathered men forgot their work to listen to things they did not need. "And a dozen buckles. And whatever nails you can spare that don't bend out of humor." "And message for me?" Dobb said, smiling again. "Some people give me letters to carry because they want to believe in the passage of time. Some people give me letters because they do not want to say the thing to a face. I prefer the first sorts." "No message," Robb said. "But if you go through White Harbor, tell Lord Wyman's dockmen that Winterfell's men respect how they packed that last barrel of smoked herring, without any broken heads. It was the neatest barrel of lies I have seen in a long time." Dobb cackled like a kettle coming to the boil. "I will tell them that their lies are neat and their fish offended. That will warm them through. The harbor winds kill warmth fast, but praise has a way of lodging in the wool." He looked to Jon again, and his eyes had sharpened almost imperceptibly. "You look like a man who decided something and is waiting to see if the world will let him do it." "Men who carry tinkers' carts red faces for a living," Jon said. "I red hands," Dobb said. "And yours have pitch on them." He loaded the buckles into a sack with a rattling that was almost cheerful. "Pitch means you intend for something to move, but not too much. Pitch means you will stay where you are long enough for the resin to bind. Men who are going over the hills and into forever don't stain their hands with that glue. They wash and never get clean. Take payment at the kitchens," Robb said with a nod to Hallis, who had hovered to ensure no nails walked away on their own legs. "Tell the cook that you deserve a bowl of stew as large as your mouth and as heavy as your cart." Dobb bowed as if paid already. "I will do that. I wish your house a winter no worse than usual, which is praise indeed from a man who sleeps under carts." He gathered his reins and clucked to the shaggy horse, who had all the wisdom of a thing that had never loved speed. The cart rolled out with a lament from one wheel, and Dobb lifted a hand without looking back. "That man sees too much," Robb said, as they went back through the gate to the inner yard. "I'd employ him if he didn't belong to the road." "He belongs to the space between," Jon said, thinking of Benjen and the wall and the white ridges north, how he had cast his mind to that space as to a different way to live, and how now he had turned it back to the spaces within walls. "Some men are very brave when no one looks. It is a good use of a life." They returned to the turret to give Luwin the letter. The maester lifted the seal with a thin-bladed knife and read without moving his mouth, a trick Jon had always admired. Luwin's brow furrowed. He handed it to Robb, and after a moment Robb handed it to Jon. The handwriting was clumsy but careful. The words laid this out: "Sheep gone missing from a fold near the marsh, and strange prints not quite wolf nor man, and a boy who said he saw eyes like coals in the reeds, and a dog torn open with more viciousness than hunger would teach." There was a line that did not belong to fear. The man who wrote said that he had tied bundles of iron around his door, the way his mother's mother had done when the night for a time had walked more thickly than usual. "I do not like the way they are afraid," Luwin said in that tone he used when he would rather talk of quantities and found himself forced to talk of qualities. We have had lean wolves and hungry men and dogs that forget what they are good for. But this has that taste that doesn't belong to young or old winter. I will send a reply. I'll ask detailed questions. If the prince are as the man says, we may have a hunter's mischief, a man with a mind that has slipped. It has happened in the reed beds before, where the world becomes a pattern and the mind cannot any longer tell what shape of a thing should be. I'll ask Hallis to send 4 men there, with enough food for a week and a rope for every man. They'll follow the tinker until he sets them near the marsh. We'll borrow Jared from the kennel. He can read a track the way Luwin reads a ledger. And we'll give them one of the wolf heads we keep for fear, Robb said. And Jon felt him stepping into the role with a steadiness that would make men set their shoulders with his. Use men who will not talk their fear back into the kitchens, Luwin murmured. Jory, Robb said and smiled. Jory doesn't talk. The first of the day's letters they set to when the sun had drifted a finger's breadth across the sky. Robb's pen had that slight leftward lean that came when he had to drag his hand so as not to smear the ink. Jon's letters were tight, efficient. Luwin corrected none of Jon's words but one set of spelling, and he tapped Jon's wrist with the feather end of the quill as if to remind him that habits deferred to house style. If you will insist on writing the older way, he said dryly, you will confuse men who have learned the new. I do not care what you write, but they will. I'll write as the house writes, Jon said. He found that work satisfied some part of him he had not known wanted feeding. The part that liked the weight of a decision measured and recorded, the part that liked to take a thing in hand that could be turned and examined and made to fit. He wrote a note to Osha in the glass gardens in a tone that would make her laugh and do as he asked regardless of her laughter. He wrote to Lord Umber with respect and without bowing. He wrote to White Harbor with praise neat and controlled so they would hear it as intelligent and not as flattery poured in buckets. He wrote to a forester who had written once before and never been answered because his letter came on a day when a king's monkey fell off a wall and broke a leg and 3 men slipped in the rush and one of them cracked his head and all the schedules went to pieces. He wrote the forester to say, "We will send men to look at the rot you found in the lower beams. If it is what you say, you will have the gold we owe you for finding it first." He held the leather tags between his fingers in the rookery, while Luwin showed him the code not that meant northeast, and the one that meant urgent, and the one that meant bring written reply if you can. The ravens watched with eminent disdain. One pecked at a bit of scab on Jon's knuckle with a small, precise curiosity that made him laugh in spite of the sting. He could do this work. He had thought himself fit for cold and edge and watch, and he was. But he was fit for this also. It felt like kneeling in the godswood, ordinary and grand. When the bells called the noon meal, Jon went to the kitchens and stood in the way where the steam could coat his hair and the spoons banged like a chorus. He spoke with the cook about the tinker and the nails and a stew to pay the road back. He collected from the woman who portioned bread a stack of loaves for the men who would be going to the marsh, and he took from the salt shelf a measure of what would keep the meat honest. He passed Caitlin in the corridor when he left, and something in him braced as if he expected a blow that never came. She did not stop. She moved like a woman who had been awake so long that sleep felt like a stranger whose name she could not recall. Her cheeks were hollowed and her eyes were not red but emptied. The sight of her had about it the holiness of grief and the sharpness of a blade. Jon bowed his head without knowing if she looked. He could think of no words to put into her air that would not sour. The passing took a heartbeat, felt like an act that would echo. He found Theon by the well, tossing a ball of ice at the old stone and catching it again when it broke apart. Theon's smile when he saw Jon was the one he saved for games he thought he could win. "Well then," he said, as if he had waited for this, "do we dress you in plain black and call you Crow? Or do you stay and make the lady of the house spit nails until the hinges you fixed melt?" "I stay," Jon said. Theon laughed, delighted and wicked. "Of course you do. The wall's cold and men up their smell like old leather. Here we have wine and girls who are not made of bark, and men who like to hear their names said by other men who know how to say them. One can be something in a hall. In a blizzard, one is only a man dying slower than the air." "You would have made a bad brother in black," Jon said. "I make a bad many things and a fair few good ones." Theon said with a shrug that managed to be both elegant and vulgar. I make a particularly excellent friend to a man who begins to have his hands on the levers. Remind me to befriend you 3 times over and then turn my coat and do it again. You are already my friend, Jon said, and Theon's smile went crooked. He folded it away before anyone coming by could see that it was not the smile he meant. Be that as it may, Theon said. If you mean to be Robb's shadow, I thought you should know that the men from Barrowton have been playing knucklebones with the guard and winning more than they lose. And winning men are often either cheats or blessed. I doubt their gods have time to bless knucklebones. Keep your eye on them, right hand. Thank you, Jon said. I'll keep my eye on their hands. Keep an eye on your own too, Theon said. And there was a quick look there, down and up, measuring. Pitch under the nail. It suits you. The afternoon was a pattern of small tasks in good sequence. The hinges done, the men named for the marsh ready and their packs weighed, the ravens sent, the letters folded and sealed and set aside, the cord measured and recorded, the grievance from the woman who said her neighbor's pig ate her grain heard and weighed and put to Jory to go and look with his own eyes. Robb's face passed through all of it like the weather. He was at ease, then tense, then laughing, then quiet, then hungry. He did not pretend to be omniscient, and because he did not pretend it, when he said he knew, men believed him. As the sun leaned toward the west, Jon kept his promise to Arya. He went to the godswood with Ghost at his heel and stood by the stones that rose like knuckles where the pool made a slow bend. The air there had the cleanliness of a thing that has been washed too often. It might have no scent, and yet it somehow smelled of being rinsed. Arya came out between the reeds with the stealth of a fox who has been told to imitate a rabbit. She did not manage it, but she tried. Her eyes lit when she saw him, and he held a finger to his mouth even though there was no one there to hear. He drew the little sword out of its wrappings. It looked like nothing in its cloth. It looked like everything when the steel caught that last light. Needle. He had called it that when he found it, and the name had rung true in his ear like the sound of a coin dropped on stone. He was not a man who believed that all names were waiting to be discovered. He knew people and things took on names like cloaks, and sometimes the cloaks were all wrong, and that was that. But this one had been right from the first moment. This is for you, he said, quiet. He said no fine words. He did not tell her that she would have to use it to kill men one day, God forbid, and yet that day might come. He did not tell her that a little sword is as dangerous as a little lie. He did not tell her that she would have to be careful where she carried it and when she took it out. He did not need to tell her any of it. She knew some of it now, and she would learn the rest like she learned where to put her feet when the stones were mossy. She took the hilt in both hands, reverent, joyful. I won't show Sansa, she said with sudden, fierce comprehension. She would tell Mother, not because she's cruel, because she thinks I should be someone else. Then don't show her, Jon said. Ghost will know you have it. He will tell no one. Ghost understands secrets, Arya said. He looks like a secret. She made a face in Ghost's direction, and Ghost yawned in contempt of faces. Stand like this, Jon said, and he placed her feet and set her shoulders and made her loosen her wrist until the blade sat in her hand like a line drawn true. He had not learned this from Syrio Farrell. He had learned it from Roderick and from his own work, and from watching how a blade wants to move when a man's body isn't fighting it. Arya watched him as if he were telling her how to steal a pie and not get caught. She tried the stance and tried it again, and shook her hair out of her eyes with sharp little tosses of her head, and did not complain once. He made her thrust at a knot in the tree bark until she could hit whatever part of the knot he decided to point to, and when she missed she hissed at herself and hit it again. You'll do, he said finally, with unforeseen pride. You'll do. I'll be better than do, Arya said, and she hugged him without asking as she did when she was half his height and not much heavier than Emil. Behind her fierce talk there was a tremor. I don't want to go south, she said into his jerkin. I don't want to go where Sansa goes and be looked at like a small doll that has fallen into mud. I know, Jon said, but you'll go, and you'll be you there anyway. Can I bring Needle? Yes, he said, and he knew he would make it so, and he would take what came of it. There are decisions that are simply true when you say them. This was one. They went back toward the yard then, because Robb would be waiting and Luwin would be waiting and the day had more life in it. They passed under the arch near the old granary, and out into the space where men threw a ball to train their arms when they were not wanted for anything else. And Theon was there with 2 men from Barrowton, knucklebones spread on a cloak and copper pieces winking among them like fish in shallow water. Jon did not stop. He did not need to. He could see already that the bones were a little shaved and that Theon knew and didn't mind. He filed it away. He would send Jory to tell the men to win within house walls if they wished and keep cheating for the road. He would not lecture men about petty sin when larger sins had rooms to themselves. To rule is to pick which fights to pick. Robb found him at the edge of the drill yard with a look that said the day was almost done but not done. Luwin wants to try sending a message after dark, he said. Something about seeing which of the ravens remembers that night isn't a wall to fly into. Night is a wall to some of us, Jon said, and Robb's mouth made that soft shape which meant he was thinking of Bran. Jon did not say the boy's name. He did not need to. He knew that every silence had that name in it like a thread through cloth. They went to the rookery and the ravens muttered around them as if reciting bad verses. Luwin showed them how the birds that had flown in the dusk before tended to be calm with it, while others flapped and hesitated. We will need to know which ones keep sense when the light deserts them, the maester said. Knowledge is only useful if you know which part of it will desert you first. They sent a bird to White Harbor with a note that did not need sun to be read, only patience. The raven took the air with a confidence that had nothing to do with gods or men and everything to do with wings. It became a shape and then not a shape and then the idea of a shape and then not even that. If the day had been my responsibility from the first bell to now, Robb said as they stood at the wall, looking out over the dark that turned the trees to a single low cloud, I think I would be tired enough to sleep until next week. You will be, Jon said. You will be again tomorrow. Will you be too? Robb asked. Jon said. We will learn to be tired together. They stepped down from the wall. The torches had been lit. The courtyard snow had taken on that iron color that night gives. Men moved in it like ghosts who had chosen not to haunt but to work. A dog barked twice and then remembered itself and stopped. The warmth from the springs rose with more confidence when the cold sharpened around it. Jon could feel the shape of his day in his bones. The kneeling at the heart tree, the setting of iron and pitch, the words written, the laughter that came when Theon could not help himself, the hesitation of men who were remembering new habits, the weight in Catelyn's face, the cold sweetness of the apple. The way the hinge's new sound had felt in his hands, the way Arya's small fingers had adjusted themselves around the hilt without fear. It made a music of work that he could imagine playing again and again until he knew it by heart. He thought of Benjen then, more keenly than he had permitted himself to think all day. He would have to go to him tonight or in the morning and say the thing that would change the look on a man's face who had always held no disappointment for him. He would have to say, I am not coming. He would have to say, I know what you offered me and I honor it, but I cannot take it. He would have to say, not now. He would have to hold steady if Benjen's mouth quirked in that way of his that said he could accept anything if it was said plainly. He would have to hold steady if Benjen did not quirk his mouth at all. The thought made the place under his heart feel empty and hard, like the frozen earth by the fish pond where the sun never fell. He found Benjen where he thought he might, at the outer wall, looking north as if it were a mirror that might tell him something he couldn't see in his own face. The wind teased the blue-black of his cloak, and the fur at the collar was rimed. Ghost sat down a few paces back as if to give them privacy. Benjen did not turn, but his mouth made that half-smile Jon knew. I thought you'd gone to chop a hole in the godswood to see if the old gods bleed, Benjen said. I woke them with my trouble, Jon said, and the older man nodded, still without looking, as if he had expected nothing else of him. You are not coming, Benjen said. He said it not to press or to punish, but to say the truth first, so that Jon would not have to put so much of himself into the admitting and could keep that part of himself for what would come after. I'm not, Jon said. Not now. Benjen pushed his breath out in a shape that showed in the air and hung there until the wind took it. The wall will be there another season, he said. It has a habit of not moving. Some things do, some things don't. You'll have to learn which you belong to. For a long time I thought I'd belong to men, and then I learned I belonged to stone in the end. It happens. I thought, Jon began, and then stopped. He would not apologize for the choice. He would honor the offer. He would not retreat into a boy's stammer because a man's decision felt larger than his tongue. You thought that leaving would be simpler, Benjen said. It often is. Hard work is staying where the knots are and picking them until the rope is smooth again. But I am not going to tell you virtue is only in staying. Men say what they say. You do what you do. Tell me, though. Tell me the right words so that I can repeat them when men ask me why the Lord's bastard changed his mind overnight. Robb asked me without asking, Jon said. Bran breathed and did not wake, and the sound of that filled the house. I couldn't put that down like a thing that belonged to someone else. And I thought of the wall, and I knew I could carry that weight another year and the wall would not mind me for it. But Robb would mind, and the hinges would mind, and Arya would mind, and Ghost would mind. Benjen laughed plainly then. Man chooses his family, and half the time they have no say in it. If I repeat it like that, men will think I'm mad. If I repeat it properly, they'll call it sense. I can do either. Both are true. They stood without speech for a small time. The north was a line, and then a thought, and then a cold that had nothing to do with wind. Do one thing for me, Benjen said, and now he looked at Jon, and his face had the carved piece of men who have stood a long time in weather and learned not to set too much store by any one feeling. When your father goes south, make sure his ravens fly straight. Men down there like to write words that use two meanings. We like words that tell you where they want to be. If you can keep his words from getting lost, you'll keep him more surely than a man following his horse's tail eastward. And send men to the marsh not because of the letter but because you must. Marshes are places where men get eaten by the ground. I have never trusted them. Give them enough rope to pull one out of another's mouth. We've done it, Jon said, not as boast but as report. Robb named Jory to lead them. They'll go before the day is old. Lewin wrote and asked the right questions. We have enough rope. I thought you might, Benjen said. There's your father's blood in that. He taught me to plan as if the world were a little worse than I hoped and a little better than I feared, and he usually turned out to be right. They parted with no ceremony. They did not clasp forearms in the shape of a vow. They did not speak of seeing one another soon. Men who mean it do not always put a rope on it. They let it lie. Jon watched Benjen's back move away and thought of the wall again, less like a vow now and more like a cousin to the godswood. Something that was there to be visited when the inner weather asked for it. The day went thinner. The men for the marsh gathered at the gate, packs heavy but not spiteful. Jory said little and looked long at each face as if to memorize the way the lines lay. Jared from the Kennels had a rope wound around his middle like a lazy snake, and a dog at his heel who was all chest and no politeness. The dog sneezed at Ghost, and Ghost did not blink. Jon checked the contents of the packs because that was a thing a right hand did. Grain, salt, a knife for each man, a spare for the foolish one who lost his, a pot, a skin of spirits that would keep a man alive if he had to sleep measured by an inch of warmth. He touched each and did not make a speech. Robb put a hand on Jory's shoulder, and that was words enough. They went down the road as the light went, and their figures were swallowed by the particular blue that lives between daylight and night. The sound of their boots lasted a little longer than their bodies lasted, and then it too was a story the stones would tell back to the sky if the sky were to ask. Night came. It was not a grand coming. The torches burned and the stars made their usual indifferent sprawl. The kitchen's last pot was washed and turned upside down. A woman drew a shutter closed and the smell of the room changed. Men went to their beds and did not all fall asleep. The silence around Bran's room tightened until it almost made a note. Catelyn sat. Sansa put her needle away and thought of a future that had too much space in it and no lines to point the way. Jon stood in the yard with Ghost and watched the north gate and listened to the knot groan of the hinges and felt that small victory as if it were a lit candle in his pocket. Robb came and stood with him and said nothing. Lewin crossed and nodded and went back to his tower with the long night for letters like an old friend in his satchel. You made your decision, Robb said at last, a statement, not a question. I did. We will learn to be good at this, Robb said, with the kind of certainty that doesn't argue with its own ghost. It will hurt. It will be dull. It will be both. There will be a day when we do it so well we will not notice. I look forward to that and dread it both. Sometimes I think that if I were given the choice between a clean battle and a week of grain counting, I would pick the battle, and I know that makes me a fool. It makes you a Stark, Jon said, which wasn't, precisely speaking, a comfort, and yet it was. Ghost lifted his head, nostrils opening. His ears twitched. Jon felt him stiffen and then relax, as if he had scented something far off and dismissed it. Not because it wasn't real, but because it wasn't here yet. What is it? Robb asked. Nothing, Jon said. Yet. They stood until the cold reached close and reminded them they were men and not towers. Then they went inside, where the springs warmed the corridors and the candles burned slow, and the rooms they learned to measure by the way their duties filled them lay waiting with their doors at modest angles to the hall. Snow fell in thin skins on the stones through the night, and the hinges at the north gate held their peace, and the old gods did not speak. But the red leaves turned in the dark and the face in the tree watched, and the house endured the first bend under a load that would only grow heavier and did not crack, not yet. The benches in the great hall were crowded and loud, a river of sound running around the stones, but the river broke around islands of quiet where great men sat and waited for words to come to them. Torches cast butter-yellow light that ran in streaks along flagons and pooled in the hollows of men's faces. The banners hung like sleeping beasts, their colors muting to dusk shades, and the heat from the braziers argued with drafts that found the seams where wall met arch and poured their cold along the floor. Jon stood with one shoulder to a pillar near the back, where servants crossed with trenchers, and where a man could see without being seen. Ghost lay at his feet, a softness of pale fur that drew eyes and then turned them away again when the wolf's gaze met theirs without apology. The king's laugh rolled like a loose cask in a wagon. Eddard Stark sat straight and nearly still beside him, his expression one that men mistook for quiet and which was in truth attention turned down into listening. Between them there was the invisible rope of old friendship and older duty, and the rope had been tugged hard these last days. Cersei Lannister wore a face as still as glass and a gown that caught the light like frost at noon. Joffrey tilted his head to catch admiration the way a plant tilts to sun, and when it did not come, he arranged his mouth to show he had chosen disdain instead. The hound ate as if each bite were something to fight. Jaime Lannister glimmered like a sword left too long within reach, all ease and polish and an edge you only felt when you had already cut yourself. Renly's mirth went up at easy intervals. Barristan Selmy drank with the same moderation that had shaped his long life. Men from the bar Rolands sat awkward in their wealth. Men from the kitchens stood by the hearth to steal heat for later. Tyrion Lannister perched high as if he had grown out of stone. He had climbed onto the window seat with its deep sill and arranged himself there like a single gargoyle come loose and resting a while, a mug nested in one hand. He did not belch like a man eager to prove his stomach could best anyone else's. He sipped as if the taste interested him more than the quantity. When Tyrion's eyes found Jon, they brightened in honest curiosity. The dwarf lifted his mug the smallest finger width, a toast narrowed to a point. Jon did not go to him at once. He watched a little longer, Robert pounding the table at a story that did not need pounding. Sansa sitting very straight, her face arranged into the patience girls are praised for. Arya staring not at her trencher but at the way the torchlight fretted along Grey Wind's back where Robb stood near the end of the high table. Grey Wind's ears had that pricked, always listening set that meant he would spring before Robb did if springing became the thing to do. Lady, curled at Sansa's feet, watched Jon with the steady mildness that seemed to be her only expression. Shaggy Dog was nowhere to be seen, which meant Rickon had him somewhere he was not supposed to be. That would be heard before it was seen. Eddard turned his head and spoke a short phrase to Robert that did not reach Jon's ears, and Robert nodded as if the words were flint for a tired fire. The king's eyes traveled across the hall then, and for a moment they passed over Jon and did not pause. There had been a time when that would have felt like a hurt. Tonight it was simply true. He moved along the wall, the secret corridors of a hall that people pretend does not have any, until he came near the window where Tyrion sat. Tyrion watched him come and did not change his face to meet him. He let it remain what it was, which was amused and open to adjustment. "So," the dwarf said when Jon was within the quiet where their voices would be their own. "Did you put the black on in your mind and then take it off again in your hands?" Jon did not know whether he should be surprised that Tyrion knew. He did not waste the surprise. "I chose to stay." Tyrion nodded as if he had been drinking with chance and had just been dealt the hand he had expected. "You will not lack for cold," he said, eyes traveling over Jon's face with an attention Jon recognized in himself when he looked at a hinge or a length of cord. "Nor for enemies, which for a man of parts is a kind of warmth." Jon leaned against the stone near the window and let his gaze go out into the dark without losing Tyrion's presence at his side. "I thought you would say I was a fool to refuse what you called a kind of honor." "I call many things many names," Tyrion said cheerfully. "Sometimes to see if the name will stick, sometimes to see what the man does with it. The wall would have made you honest by simplicity. This place will try to make you dishonest by complications. I am curious which will prove stronger, your nature or your circumstances." "You might save your curiosity for something that will change with watching," Jon said. It was not unkind. "Everything changes with watching," Tyrion replied. "Not always in the way you hope. I meant to tell you you were right to go north. Now I mean to tell you you are right to remain. It keeps me a consistent man." "You could tell me something useful instead," Jon said, and Tyrion smiled again, wider this time. "Very well." He held up 2 fingers and wiggled them as if counting a child's game. "First, wear what they throw at you as if you chose it. Names, looks, doubts. If a man makes you a coat out of his scorn, put it on and show him how well it fits. Second, do not mistake hearing a thing many times for it being true. The hall is a wheel for rumor. The stableyard oils the axles. Third, have a 4th ready. Men like 3s in their advice. Give them 4 and you can hide the one that matters most." "And the one that matters most?" Jon asked. "Do not tell it to a Lannister," Tyrion said, and laughed softly at himself. "Drink." "I've had stew," Jon said. "It sticks better to the ribs." "It does," Tyrion agreed. His gaze flicked toward the high table and then back. His voice dropped the smallest degree. Not conspiratorial, only careful. "I take it you have told Lord Eddard." "I will," Jon said. That won him a sharp look, not disapproving, not kind. "Ah," Tyrion said, as if he had been shown a blade worth handling. "Well, do it before some other mouth does it before you." Ghost stirred, lifted his head and yawned enormously, tongue curled, fangs telling their quiet truth. Tyrion looked delighted. "If I could have had one of those," he said, "I would have eaten very few men and made friends with many cowards." "They don't eat men," Jon said, because he knew the wolves were not the thing to make a jape of. Not with the sound the world had been making lately. Not unless a man chooses to be their enemy. "Then may the men in your path choose better enemies," Tyrion said, and turned his face toward the hall once more, to watch with the patience of a man who had learned to sit where the jokes could not reach him unless he invited them. The hall ended late. Men do not want to release themselves from noise when their beds have silence waiting in them. Jon slipped away before the last tankard thudded. The corridor beyond the great doors breathed the hot spring's damp, and in it a small boy with a candle and a solemn expression went carefully along the wall to make the sconces ready for the night. He was the same boy who had been given parsnips in a basket earlier. His candle made a wobbling circle with more bravery than flame. In his chamber, the air had the faint smell of the oil he used on Ghost's pads when the frost bit too deep. Ghost sprang to the pallet and then remembered himself and leaped down again to lay on the rushes near the door, head on his paws and eye half open. Jon sat on the bed, elbows to knees, and felt the weight of his decision set itself deeper into him as the room's stillness took his heat. He slept late, when the night's edges had already begun to whiten, and his last thought before sleep's thin ice took him was of Benjen's mouth making the shape of a smile without the work of it, and of Robb saying, "We will learn to be tired together," which had felt like the first real oath of his life. In the morning the light had the clarity of cold. It came into the yard like a blade made only to separate blue from white. Smoke went up in straight lines until the wind remembered to move. The mews were a grouse of discontent, the kennels a mutter of dog breathing. Jon ate standing up in the buttery with two soldiers who argued amiably about whether the lake ice was thick enough to trust a foolish boy. He finished his bread and cheese and went with Ghost at his heel to find Maester Luwin before Robb took the first of the day's petitions. Luwin had a slate full of notes so small they might have been a flock of tiny blackbirds at rest. He greeted Jon with a nod that meant both approval and a correction. "Two things from last night," Luwin said, tapping his quill with that gentle impatience of his. "We amended the letter to White Harbor. Master Tobo, of course, is in King's Landing. We will address the Guild of Glasswrights at White Harbor by their proper style. And the Glass Gardens. Speak to Garth who keeps them, not to anyone else. He has the measure of which pains can be saved and which must be cast new." Jon inclined his head. "Garth," he said, "and would remember. A small shame bloomed and then died. Better to catch an error in the nest than to watch it take wing and foul half the town." Luwin's eyes softened. "Your instinct to praise is good," he said. "Apply it with a smaller spoon than a ladle and men will taste it better." "Robb?" Jon asked. "In the great hall already," Luwin said. "He wants you at his left." It was not much different from the day before, and yet it was not the same. The men who waited at the foot of the dais sat their weight differently when Jon came to stand beside Robb. They arranged their faces into straighter lines. One of the old men from Molbert? No, Molestown was by the wall, and this was meat from closer fields. Stood with his cap twisting in his hands until Jon smiled at him without showing teeth, and then the man remembered he had meant to speak. A washerwoman talked about a girl who had run and would not be found. Roderick Castle offered to have the girl found by men who would walk their eyes around corners instead of shoving them. Roderick's whiskers were bristled into a half-moon this morning, and he smelled faintly of oil and leather. He had a voice that made things feel less foolish by the end of a sentence than they had at the start. A steward from the granary brought a tally. Jon had not liked the look of the day before and liked less this morning. He bent over it with Robb while the steward waited with his mouth in a line he probably used on his children when they had eaten the last of the honey. The numbers sang to Jon as Luwin said they should. They sang a tune that said, "Someone's clever cousin is being cleverer than he should be with casks and quantities." Jon laid his finger on a column where the grain reported leaving the store did not in any world match the mouths that had been fed. He murmured it to Robb as if sharing a joke. Robb's mouth did not smile, but his eyes warmed. "Bring Wexley from the south store," Robb told the steward in a tone that did not sharpen. "Bring him now if you please, and with the keys that we gave to him and not to himself." When Wexley came, he came quickly and then stopped in the doorway as if the speed had been a mistake. He was a thin man who had the look of someone who was cold even when the room ran warm. He held the keys put out before him like proof or apology. Jon had learned before breakfast that some men could be straightened by a sharp word. Wexley looked like one who would tangle more. He had a cousin who had lost 2 fingers to a millstone. Men who were careful by virtue of fear often made careful thieves. Jon did not think Wexley a thief yet. He thought him a man who could become one if he noticed how easy it could be. Robb did not accuse. He named the numbers and the mouths like facts. Wexley's face ran through a series of small changes. None of them quite a lie, all of them evasions. When men realized they were being allowed to walk out of a trap with their dignity under their own arm, they often chose gratitude. Wexley chose relief, which was dangerous only if one forgot to collect on it. "We will have you bring us in," Robb said finally. "For a fortnight. You will sit with Jon while he goes through the list. He will tell you when he finishes. If the numbers lie again, the keys will have different hands to keep them warm. If they tell the truth when they ought, we'll say so to anyone who asks." He turned slightly toward Jon, enough that Wexley's eye would catch the motion. "If there is coin missing, we will not spread the story before we are sure who owns it." Wexley swallowed so hard Jon could feel the shape of it in his own throat. "My lord," he managed, which wasn't an answer and would do. When the man had gone, Robb blew out a breath and said, I would rather fight a sack of rats." "You will not," Jon said, deadpan. "A sack of rats would eat through your armor." Roderick lowered his whiskers from a position approximating the heavens. "I've seen it," he said, in the voice of men who have seen whatever their humor requires. "They go for the straps first. Carrion-minded beasts." "Your morning is full," Luwin murmured near Jon's ear, putting 2 more folded papers into his hand. One was a reply from White Harbor, using twice as many words as the sense required but including the sense nonetheless. The Glassrights would send a master glazier when their ship's deck was safe from the last of the early storms. Garth would be advised on patching in the meantime. The other paper was a tight letter with the umber hand like a charge across a field. "Men hungry past Crow's Nest. Icicles thick as cudgels. Boys grown wild with no winter work." Lord Umber wrote as if he could split a log with his thumb. Jon liked him a little without ever having been in a room with him. By noon, Jon had set Wexley in the counting room with 2 barrels and 1 slate, and the white fear on the man's face had cooled to the kind of attention that keeps numbers from doing tricks. He went with Robb to the practice yard then because the body does not take orders from the mind after a certain number of sums. Roderick made them both sweat until their breaths made smaller and smaller clouds, and gray wind stood with a patience that looked like consideration of murder. The wolf did not love practice. He loved the thing after practice more. Ghost sat beyond the ring and watched the way men's boots slid and did not slide, a quiet scholar of balance. When the thud and rasp were done, Jon washed at the pump, the water a lively slap. The hound crossed the yard with his long stride that used less effort than it should, and a squire scuttled behind him with a helm that looked lighter in his arms than it would in a head. Theon strolled with a boy's insolent charm and spoke a greeting with 3 words and 2 smirks. "There's a hedge knight drinking by the inner gate," Theon said to Robb, as if gossip were a cup he was pleased to share. "He says he fought under a Connington in the Stormlands. He says many things. The only true one is that he carries a dent that has not seen a hammer in 10 years. "Send him to Micken," Jon said, running the last of the water off his face. "If he can carry a lance straight enough to make a doll's head judder, he can drill the boys at the North Field tomorrow. If he can't, he can carry buckets until he remembers that water and wine are not the same." "You command a pretty little kingdom," Theon said, amused. "Shall I bow?" "You'll strain something," Jon said. Theon's grin flashed. Then he was gone on some game of his own that would entertain him until it bored him. They took bread and stew at a trestle in the sun by the stone where Jon had given Arya her blade the night before. The mark of her practice thrusts was a constellation on the bark. At first only raw dots, then a pattern, then a promise. Arya herself was nowhere to be seen. Septa Mordane had a voice that could draw the wildest animal into a chair if not into a gown. Sansa passed with her, the Septa talking and Sansa's head bent. Lady followed, perfectly behaved. Jon's breath made a shape inside him that did not quite ease when they had gone. "Go and tell Garth we may have glass by month's end," Robb said when they had eaten, and Jon nodded. Ghost rose without prompting. Gray wind shoved his nose against Robb's palm and took the last of the crust as if it were the priest's bread in some foreign faith and he the hungriest god. The glass gardens breathed out their own weather. The air in them had that green, close feel of a place that is not a forest but would be if given enough patience. The panes above were a patchwork of age and repair, some clear as a still pond, some bubbled like old glass does when it remembers the fire that made it. Garth was a slow man until you set him in his beds. Then his hands moved with a knowledge that looked like speed. He wore a cap stitched by a woman who loved him once and a ferocity toward broken panes that had saved Winterfell's table more than once. He greeted Jon with the brevity of a man who tells everything else to his soil. "We'll have a man from the harbor by the time the 3rd snow has crusted," Jon told him. "Keep your heat where you can. Luwin says be careful of the south wall. It leaks more than the north." "I told him that," Garth said, not insulted. "But he needs to tell me so that I know he knows. That's how a place is kept. Tell him I've put straw on the worst and I'll put boys under the rest if he gets me more boys." "I'll send Hodder up with you this afternoon," Jon said. "He can lift what 3 boys lift and does not break." He smiles when the work goes well. Garth grunted in gratitude. And he doesn't touch what he doesn't know. If every man in this castle had that sense, I'd sleep like a dog after a hunt. On the way back, they met Old Nan in the passage that ran warm along the kitchens. Old Nan moved at the pace of a slow clock, but her eyes saw faster than most men's. Rickon trotted beside her, his small hand in the big, scrolled grip of hers. Shaggy Dog humping along too close to his heels. Shaggy Dog's dark fur made him a shadow that chose to move. Rickon saw Jon and Robb and brightened in that way only small children and hungry men do. He growled at the bread, Rickon said at once, accusatory, pointing at the wolf. He growled at my bread like he wanted to eat it, and then he didn't eat it. And that is a very bad wolf. Maybe he wanted you to put honey on it first, Robb said, swift as a hand to catch a falling cup. Wolves deserve sweetness too, Rickon considered. Ghost doesn't, he said, suspiciously admiring. Ghost just goes quiet and then Mother says he's being good. He's not good. He's just very quiet. Ghost blinked as if to say the accusation did not rise to the level of his notice. Shaggy Dog bared his little teeth in a grin that was already more threat than joke. Old Nan patted Rickon's head as one pats a seasoned horse. The little lord doesn't like that Bran sleeps, she announced to no one and everyone. He goes to the door and then he doesn't go in. He will have to do one or the other. A boy who learns to stay in doorways grows up into a man who forgets which side his feet belong to. Jon crouched so his face was nearer Rickon's. I'll go with you, he said. You can stand by me if you like. Rickon looked at him as if the offer were a bird in a trap and might fly away if looked at wrong. Then he nodded hard enough that his hair flopped into his eyes and trailed after Jon with Shaggy Dog at his heel. Old Nan in their wake at her one certain pace. The room where Bran slept was hot with human concern and the measured burn of banked fires. The breath of the room was thick. Catelyn sat as she always sat when she was there. Not like a woman at rest, but like one who waits for shoes to fill with water, so she will know she is in the river. She looked up when the door moved. Jon stilled. Rickon moved between Jon's knees and peered around him in that child's way that uses people as furniture. Hello, Mother, Rickon announced, immediate and grave. Shaggy wants honey on his bread. Robb said it. And Jon wants me to stand up and then also to go to sleep. Jon swallowed his laugh until it emptied of the wrong sound. I want you to do whatever you decide, he said. I'll stand here. Ghost will lie down there and dream. Shaggy can have honey if he asks with his tail and not his teeth. Catelyn's gaze slid over Jon as if he were a cold draft and not a man. It rested on Rickon and softened the smallest, most human amount. Do not bring the wolf near the bed, she said, and her voice could have cut bread. If he gets on the mattress, I'll skin him and make you a hat. Old Nan snorted, not as insolence but as punctuation. You won't skin anything, girl, she said, lapsing into the old name for a woman whose children she had watched put down roots. And there was love in the rudeness and grief that had found a chair and sat its weight there. You will sit and hold onto the chair for another day and then another. The wolves know how to lie down where they're told when it matters. Rickon's hand tightened on Jon's breeches. Jon stood and felt the heat like a weight across his back. Bran's face stayed the face of sleep without dreams. Summer lay under the bed, a long, careful sigh escaping him at intervals as if he had learned to breathe for two. Jon wanted to say a name to him and let it be prayer. Instead he stood until Rickon decided he had stood enough, which was a long time for a boy that small. When they left, Catelyn said nothing to Jon and he said nothing to her, and in the space between the words there was the quiet of something necessary and unpleasant, the way a bone sits after it is set. In the corridor outside, Eddard Stark waited with his hand on the lintel as if the stone could tell him whether it had felt the boy breathe. He looked at Jon with that plain regard he had given him since Jon had been small enough to fit into the arc of his arm and be taught to sit a horse without clutching at the strap. For half a breath Jon thought of going by, not to avoid his father's eyes, but because he felt in himself the readiness of a bow called to bend, and he was not sure his voice would place the arrow where it should. Ned, Old Nan said, making a small, precise bob that would have been a curtsy in a memory. The little lord stood, and now he goes to be a boy again. Eddard touched Rickon's head, and the hair smoothed in that old, obedient way hair does for a father's hand. "Good," he said to Rickon. "You are braver than your brothers together." Rickon's chest swelled in delight at the lie. He darted away like a thrown thing, old Nan's slow tide following. Eddard looked past Jon to where Ghost had sat, then down to Jon with a question in his eyes that was not hard to understand. "I had meant to find you before the hall," Jon said, voice low. "I will not ride north with Benjen." Eddard's face did not change suddenly. It changed like a still pond does when a trout decides to show itself and then does not. "Tell me why," he said simply. "Robb asked me without asking," Jon said. "Bran asked me without speaking. The house has weight and it is not carried properly on one back. I thought the wall would always be there. This will not." Eddard's eyes flicked toward the door and then back. "And when you decided, did you tell that to yourself first, or did you tell it to your pride?" Jon took the blow and nodded because it was not a blow but a test of muscle. "I told both," he said. "The second agreed with the first because it liked the taste of the word necessary." "I will not keep you from being necessary," Eddard said. "It is a way to live. It is not a warm blanket. It will not care for you when you are cold. But if you choose it, it will keep your back straight. You will not find many thanks, and you will have to be grateful for fewer. If you can manage that, you will have done something that most men can't." "If you had wanted me to go north," Jon said and stopped. "I am not a man who finds joy in saying no to my sons," Eddard said. "It is enough work saying no to the world. I am glad you came to me with your head already decided. I am spared an argument. I will miss you where I thought you would be, and I will miss you where you are. That is the way of fathers and of sons." Jon felt heat behind his sternum, the way iron warms when it is held close to a fire. He found he could say nothing that was not unworthy of the moment. So he bowed his head once and accepted that silence could do a man's work. Eddard touched his shoulder in passing, as if the contact might let him know the width of the bones there. Then he went through the door and into the room where his boy slept, and the door closed softly and the corridor set the scene back down where it had been. By late day Jory had not yet sent a bird, which meant only that chasing anything through a reed-choked marsh was slower than men tell in stories. Hallis Mullen saw the men for the marsh off the previous evening. He returned to Jon with a list written in his straight, block letters, small triumph plain in his voice. None of them had forgotten rope or salt or a second knife for the clumsy one. Micken's boy had swum in the pond for a dare a month past. It made him a good carrier of pots and a poor candidate for subtlety. Jory had taken him anyway because pots are the difference between a supper and a night of stories told about suppers that never came. Jon took Robb by the lower wall where the lichen kept its own counsel and the stone warmed itself in the low sun. "When Jory sends word, we will decide how many more men go," he said. "If he asks for none, we send none. If he asks for 10, we send 8. If he asks for the world, we ask him to make do with the corner we can spare." Robb smiled. "And if he asks for a just and merciful God to rule over men, we send him a letter saying that is above our strength," Jon said. Robb laughed, and some of the day's weight sloughed off him like snow from a sloped roof. They were interrupted by a silver flash that turned out to be Jaime's smile and a gold glimmer that turned out to be his hair. He came without hurry, as if men came with him even when they did not. He looked from Robb to Jon and tilted his head the tiniest amount. "I had thought to find your brother climbing the wall and dropping stones on passing Lannisters," he said pleasantly. "Instead I find 2 young lords standing where their elders stand." Robb inclined his head just enough to be polite without being drawn. "We practice doing it without falling off," he said. "A king loves neat heirs," Jaime said. "A kingdom loves doors that open and close as if by themselves." "Who fixes your doors, may I ask?" Jon met his eyes and found there the practiced brightness of a man who knows exactly how dangerous he is and is bored by it. "We do," Jon said, "with pitch and patience." "Ah," Jaime said, amused, "a northern answer. My father says pitch is for ships and patience for men who cannot afford something better. I find both do more work than gold in the end." "And who cleans your swords?" "Roderick shouted us into that habit long ago," Robb answered. "We feared his voice more than rust." "Good," Jaime said. "One day you will be glad of whatever fear taught you sense." He let the edge of a glance fall along Jon, curious but not prying. "I am told your house grows wolves like some men grow weeds. Keep them fed. Hungry beasts make clergy of us all." He moved on, all shine and softness, and the air around the place he had been took a moment to turn back into Winterfell's air. Robb watched him go with that narrow look men get when they cannot decide if the thing before them is a marvel or a problem. "Sometimes I think he is all stories told about a man shoved into one body," Robb said. "If I tried that, I would spill out." "You'd spill and he collects," Jon said. "We'll do with our own weight." Toward dusk the raven came from Jory. The bird bore itself as if it had flown only to put a feather in its own cap. Luwin eased the message open and let the words out into the room. The hand was Jory's. Small, steady, no flourishes. The marsh was what marshes are. The ground moving under you as if you had asked the earth to dance and it had agreed out of malice. There were prints that went from the reeds to the water and back again where a clever man could have made them. But there was also the gutted dog and the sheep with its ears cut as neat as by a knife, and a boy who had said coals for eyes and then said he had never seen such eyes in his life and please don't tell my mother I said it. Jory would camp on the dry, or the less wet, and send 2 men to circle south to see where the prince ceased to be nonsense. He would send another bird if the nonsense turned to danger. If it turned to nothing, he would send one that said so in fewer words. "Good," Robb said. "He does not see what he wants to see." "Jory never does," Luwin said with satisfaction. After, when the lamps were being set one by one like small assurances, Jon found himself in the armory where the light makes a different sound, muted by leather and steel. Mikken was filing a thing so slowly and carefully it cannot have been anything a man would notice if it were wrong. He looked up with that squint of pride he saved for work too fine to boast of. "Hinges quiet?" he asked. "They purr," Jon said. "As much as iron purrs." He lifted the cover of a chest and ran his eye along the heads of nails in their leather bag, the way one learns to count by presence and by absence both. He took measure in his head. Enough for new gates if they had to replace the whole south swing. Not enough if the winter came hard to the barns and all the doors decided to tell stories at once. "We'll need a barrel of nails before the 3rd melt." "I'll tell Jane to watch the postern," Mikken said. "The last time a barrel came, a boy threw himself into it to hide because he thought he'd stolen something anyone would beat him for. We poured him out like grain." "Did he do it again?" Jon asked. "No," Mikken said with satisfaction. He stole something easier to hide the next time. When Jon left the armory, the night had come to the yard with its usual quiet purpose. There were fewer men about than the evening before. The king and his inner circle had grown bored with sitting and would hunt in the morning if the world did not trip them first. Theon had collected his Barrowton men for a dice game with no dice but the same amount of losing. Wexley had taken to scratching columns of figures on the wooden table in the counting room with his forefinger even when no chalk was near. Jon took that as a good sign. Ghost paused near the north gate and sniffed toward nothing Jon could see. Jon put his palm on the cool of the new-set hinge and felt there the smallest hum. A song of weight and friction that he understood now as he understood how Robb's breath changed when he was about to ask a thing that cost him. He slept well that night, which meant only that when he woke he did so from the middle of a dream and had to climb back into himself as if the bed were a bank and he had slid into a cold stream. Ghost was already sitting up, as if he slept with only half his mind. The morning brought with it an ordinary bustle and the uncommon sight of a king well before his noon temper. Robert stood in the yard with a boar spear and a grin as wide as 2 winters and a voice that made dogs wince. Eddard's mouth was a thin running line. Renly wore hunting leather with absurd perfection and made a show of tightening his girth with theatrical competence until the man who actually cared for the horse did it for him. Joffrey looked like a boy pretending to be a man pretending to be a god. Sandor watched him the way men watch a fire when the thatch is dry. Robb had been invited and then not, which was the sort of insult court makes and does not notice. He accepted it with the grace that made men twice his age pause. Jon stood near the wall and watched the tangle form and then unspool itself, knowing that he was watching not merely a hunt but a collection of lessons wearing antlers. The party left in a bright snarl of voices, the sound of hooves thrown like handfuls of gravel across the yard, and then Winterfell was itself again, relieved as a chair when a loud man stands up from it and goes outside. The day's work felt easier for the absence of that sound. It filled itself with letters that asked questions in place of making claims, with a walk to the mill to ask the miller whether he thought the river's skin would hold 2 men and a boy and whether he would be foolish enough to test it. With a moment near the kitchens where Gage, the cook, gave Jon a heel of bread as if he were still 6 and had been rhymed all morning and deserved reward simply for being present in Winterfell's weather. Hodder carried bales to Garth's straw like a man who has not learned to dislike moving, and so does it gladly. Jon saw him bend without complaint to push a cart that would have broken a less willing man, and the smile that flickered over Hodder's face when the cart moved seemed reward enough to him, and perhaps it was. Near midday, Jaime Lannister again, but this time without any of his family or their gravity. He leaned a shoulder to the same pillar Jon had chosen the night before and watched Roderick put boys through a paces set. His expression was oddly gentle. "That old man loves his craft," he said softly, not to be overheard. "If I could wish one thing for every boy who will ever lift steel, it would be a teacher who loves the sound a blade makes when it is learning the world." "Roderick speaks, and men hear iron," Jon said. Jaime's smile was a shard of mirror. "He speaks, and men hear their fathers if they were lucky. If not, they hear the fathers they wish they had had. That will do." Gray wind drifted nearer, all curiosity and wariness. Jaime looked the wolf over without flinch, as you might a fine sword that could decide to bend itself into a noose. "They will follow you," he said to Jon, perhaps meaning the wolf, perhaps meaning something else. "Be careful what you teach them to listen for." "I will," Jon said, and Jaime, having given advice without chalking up a debt, turned and went, his cloak a soft line in the cold. The raven from Jory came late afternoon and shook its feathers as if it had flown through more than air. Luwin cut the seal cleanly and read aloud because this was Winterfell's business. Jory had found where the prince ended, at a place where the marsh gave way to a bank of ground as sound as any along that stretch, and there the spoor turned from single track to a confusion of many. He had found a circle where someone had made a fire that left no ash he could find, and a boy's toy carved crudely and tossed aside as if a child had been there and been taken away hungry, or had been there and run at a sudden word. He had found a woman's shoe with the strap broken and no foot in it, and a length of iron set along a sill that did not belong to any man he knew from that bog. He had set 2 men to walk out along paths only the reeds would know to see if any of the missing sheep had been led and not chased. "Send him men?" Robb asked. "Send him bread and another rope for each of them," Jon said. "And tell him I trust his nose more than a stranger's testimony. We will think on the rest." Luwin already had the parchment for the bread set aside, as if he had known the word would be said. "I will tell him his sense is ours," he said. "He knows it, but men do better when the words are written and not only felt." As the day turned its face toward night, the king's hunt came laughing back without a boar and with a story about a hare so large it had peered over Renly's saddle without jumping. Robert was drunk on air and exercise and wine's promise. Cersei walked in their echo with her face a painting of approval fitted into a frame of indifference. Joffrey carried an empty spear and a full grievance. Sandor kept his shadows where Joffrey could use them as a place to hide. Eddard's mouth had that firm set when he'd been forced to be the only adult in the room for longer than 3 breaths and could still manage it. At supper, Jon sat on the edge of a bench with Robb and Theon and the men who would sleep nearest the doors. Sansa's laugh came like a chime struck carefully at intervals. Arya's absence was the sort that fills space. Septa Mordane scolded her anyway, and Sansa took the scolding with an expression that might one day be useful in a court where men like to see their reflections in a girl's patience. Theon told a story about a Wintertown girl who had tried to sell him a ribbon and ended by selling him a notion that he would be clever forever. Jon let the story run its course without giving it more road. Robb listened, laughing at the right places, his mind not in the story at all but on Wexley's columns and Jory's letter and Catelyn's eyes. When the hall began to thin, Tyrion slid past like a fish and materialized at Jon's elbow as if he had never left the windowsill. "You have learned to look like furniture," he observed, not unkindly. "It helps a man hear. Men talk loudest when they think the table is listening," Jon said. "And they think poorly when the wine's tongue is in their mouth," Tyrion replied. "If you keep standing where you do, you may one day hear the thing that keeps a man alive." He lifted his mug in that tiny, private salute again and melted into the last ruin of laughter the evening had to offer. The quiet came down. Jon walked the postern path by the old tower because his feet asked for it. Ghost padded, pausing where a smell caught the air and sifting it as if he meant to file it on a shelf. The moon was a clean coin, the sky a purse not bothered to be shut. Jon thought of the marsh and the shoe with no foot and the boy's toy. It would be easy to make a story out of it, to draw around the facts a beast he had already decided lived in those reeds. He would not do it. He would hold the facts as stones in his hand until they told him how to build a wall or a hearth. He slept and did not dream of the wall. He dreamed of rope, which means only that his mind remained in Winterfell even when it floated. The morning after brought the king's impatience back to the yard. Robert did not like sitting for long when the sitting had no girls in it. He made men move by moving himself, and then laughed when their movement did not come fast enough. Eddard went with him to the Kennels, and then to the Mews, and then to the glass gardens where Garth told him more about pains than any lord requires. Cersei gave orders to servants who could not be seen listening to her, and then listened to herself being obeyed. Little levers being set for later, Jon thought, and filed it. You had to know where the levers were even when you could not move them without breaking a joint you wanted to keep sound. Benjen came to Jon at the North Walk where the shadows are always a degree colder and the wind knows its own name. He wore the night about him with the untroubled ease of a man who does not consider it a garment. His eyes had that blue that is not color so much as temperature. "You're sure?" he said. Jon nodded. Benjen's smile came and went like a bird skimming water. "Then you will be stubborn," he said, "which suits you, and you will have to break a little in places to stay here, which also suits you. I'd tell you to learn to bend where you can, but the world will school you in that without your uncle's help. You'll take the road north soon," Jon said. "Tomorrow," Benjen said. "The King's Company begins their southern slump, and I've no interest in watching men peel themselves from chairs. Your father will run with them halfway down and then stop and then go with them again. He has a habit of doing the right thing twice." They looked out over the white fields and the thin folds in the land where the earth remembered its own stories. Ghost put his chin on the stone in that boneless way of his and watched their breath make plumes. "Send me a crow when you can," Jon said. "Send me one that bites. I'll send you the one that bites me first, and you can tell it that its manners are poor," Benjen said. He put his hand out then and Jon took it, not with a boy's bursting need but with a man's simple respect. "Mind the hinges," Benjen added, which was his way of saying take care of this place. "I will," Jon said, which was his way of saying I will take care of all of it. The day they began to prepare for departure had its own taste. Iron at the back of the tongue and a dryness under the teeth. The yard became a place where straps were checked and unbuckled and checked again, where barrels rolled upon their rims with notes that told of fullness or of emptiness, where men made lists with their voices because their hands were busy and then learned to trust the hands instead. Robb went everywhere, not to command but to be present where a mistake might be made so that he could prevent it by the simple act of looking. Jon went behind, not as a shadow but as a second line. He picked up what Robb had not had time to see and made it straight. Wexley brought the new slate with numbers that looked chastened. Jon thanked him in the hearing of two men who had not cared for him and watched their faces make small concessions to his existence. Sansa stood in the stable door a long time, as if trying to make a painting of leaving so perfect she could carry it away with her. Lady sat at her feet with all the grace of a queen's dog. Arya climbed halfway up the ladder to the hayloft and then down again, unable to decide between up and down and so trying to learn to be both. Septa Mordain stood with a mouth like a clasp. Catelyn did not come to the yard. She sat with Bran and the house bent around that fact the way a wire cage bends under the weight of snow and holds until it cannot. Eddard found Jon by the north gate with the key to the hinge still in his pocket. "I thought you'd be here," he said. "I have the bad habit of returning to places where necessary things happen," Jon said. Eddard's mouth moved. It was not a smile and not one. "I will ride with the king to the first ford," he said. His face closed a little more, a shutter drawn carefully. "After that, I think." The road continues. Jon felt it then, not as a surprise but as the moment when something you had felt moving underfoot shows itself above the ground. "You will go with him," he said. It was not a question. Eddard looked out over the road as if he could see the south from here. "I will," he said. "It is not a thing any man would call easy. It is not a thing I would mark upon a calendar with joy. Yet I have always known that when a friend you have loved longer than you have hated anything asks you to do a thing that will keep his realm from crumbling, you do it. Even if the stones you must step upon take the skin from your feet." Jon did not say be careful. That is what boys say to fathers when they still believe that words can put armor on men. He said, "Luwin will send crows. I will see that they fly straight and their meanings with them." "Do," Eddard said. He set his hand against the gate where the pitch had gone black and smooth. His palm made a whisper. "This we can do," he said. It was both comfort and creed. Benjen's parting was more like the mist going off the lake than like any spoken farewell. He mounted without breaking the line of his body into something sentimental and raised two fingers that looked exactly like anyone else's two fingers until you had gone a winter without seeing them and then realized you missed their shape. He rode out with his rangers and the road took them and made them smaller and then unimportant and then memory. Jon stood at the hinge until the sound of hooves ceased, then turned back to the work of seeing a king off without losing the castle's sense of itself. If there was a moment when Winterfell could have lost that sense, it was when the royal litter creaked and servants ran and the king shouted for a drink he had not wanted until he found he did, and Cersei's look cut like a shard of bottle glass. But Robb stepped into that crack as if he had learned to walk on the edges of things, and Jon stood just behind and to the left and used his eyes like hands. Wexley's tally was right and he did not run. Garth came to the yard to stand under the gray sky and not be in the glass gardens for a while. Mikken wiped his palms on a cloth that had been its own story for 10 years and then folded it with the care of a pious man handling relics. Tyrion came on foot, of course, with a horse led for him with a saddle that had had the sense beaten into it by a better master than luck. He caught Jon's eye and gave him that small, private nod he seemed to have invented for him. "We leave you with your hinges and your ropes," he said. "If you were a man I could hire, I would do it twice and pay you half as much both times. I might take that bargain and make you think you had one," Jon said, and Tyrion laughed, genuine and quick. "Here," the dwarf said. He dug in his cloak and brought out a rolled scrap of parchment sealed with no seal at all. A book list, for a mind that intends to play at doors and levers with other men's words. A few spines worth leaning on. The maester will have half. The other half you can ask White Harbor for, and they will send them if you tell them the wrong men asked. His eyes gleamed. And another list, men in your yard who cheat at dice, for your private amusement. Burn it after you enjoy it. I'll pretend to be surprised by the names, Jon said. He tucked the list away and felt it warm against his ribs through the leather, a token of something like friendship that neither of them would insult by naming. He did not exchange words with Cersei. He did not blush under Joffrey's attempt to look through him. He did not make a show for Robert or for Renly. He stood where a right hand might, and he stood as if the position had been built into the stones. When the train went out and the banners dwindled into a strip of color as thin as thread, Winterfell exhaled, and the breath it made was colder and clearer and its own. After the leaving there is always a hungering emptiness, the way you feel the weight of a ring removed after a long wearing. The yard looked too bare and then remembered itself. The men went to tea-colored ale as if liquid could replace noise. It never can, but it helps. The silence around Bran's room changed shape. No longer a competing quiet with the king's talk, it was now the house's one song. Catelyn remained at her chair and Robb went to her twice in a day and said 2 sentences, which was all that truth would permit. Jon went not at all. That was what sense permitted. He took his sense like a spoonful of bitter draught and did not grimace. Arya ran the old wall 3 times, feet light, gray wind sometimes pacing her and sometimes coming later to taste the air she had stirred. That night, when even the torches burned with less drama, Ghost woke with a low sound. Not a growl exactly. Something in between a question and an answer. Jon's sleep peeled away like a skin. He lay for a breath, listening the way a hunter listens when the forest decides to inform him. He heard the small murmur of water under the floor, the pop of a coal remembering a story, a footfall where no foot should be just then. Ghost's head turned toward the corridor. Jon rose without the scrape of a heel. He did not reach for his sword by reflex. He took the long way of the room to put the door between himself and the shape beyond it. The corridor smelled of wax and old stone and the faint, hard tang of winter iron. Jon eased the door back the smallest degree and saw a figure at the far end moving against the light from a casement. Then away. Not a servant, not one of their guards. This was a man carrying his breath with the care of someone who has been taught not to spend it. Ghost's lips had not lifted, which might mean nothing or everything. Jon let the man go. He did not follow with loud steps to make a scene. He kept the shape of him in his mind and the way his shoulder carried its load, and the way he stopped before turning a corner as if listening for a thing out of sight, and he took that and laid it by, a tool on a shelf. He slept after more easily for having done nothing. He woke into a day that put frost on the barrel hoops and lit the garden panes with a light you could almost hear crack. A raven from Jory waited in the rookery with the patience of birds, which is to say none at all. Luwin had wetted the wax and tied the tag already. The note told them the sheep were found, 3 with their ears cut, the rest huddled by a stand of good earth as if intelligence had led them there and then deserted them. The boy who saw coals for eyes had, under question, said those were the eyes of a man he did not know who stood in the reeds and watched a long time, and then went away without moving. An odd lie, and yet the only one the boy could keep to. A woman was missing, her shoe found, her name not given. Jory would return by the second evening with the men he took, all of them still numbered, and see with the house whether what lay at the edge of the marsh wanted seeing again. None of that is better, Robb said after Luwin had done. None is worse. It is as the world is, Jon said, which is to say, a slice of it only. After duty, and because men who mean to stand well must keep their bodies honest, Jon took a practice sword to the yard. Roderick nodded with that particular pleasure teachers have when pupils come unasked. He paired Jon with a man who had the look of a wood that trains its own branches, and they moved around each other in that civilized dance that does not resemble real death and yet teaches the foot where to go when life dirties its hands. Ghost lay along the shadows and ratcheted an ear when the men's boots pressed snow to squeak. Gray wind sprawled at the far edge. He looked like idleness and was not. Theon appeared, already laughing at something he had not yet said. If I'd known you were going to be useful, I'd have started liking you earlier, he called to Jon. As it is, I'll have to be content with pretending I thought well of you all along. Your pretense is always convincing, Jon muttered, and Theon grinned wider. They crossed swords until neither of them cared about anything but the way metal met wood and what it did to the hand and the arm. When they were done, and the sweat had cooled and taken a bite of heat with it, Theon came near enough to lower his voice. Farland says someone's been at the Kennels at odd hours, he said. He says it like a man who thinks he's being told a story by his own oldness. I told him he was only being Farland. He did not laugh. Who? Jon asked. Ha! Theon said. If he knew that, he'd not be telling me in the yard. He would be telling the man to stop, and the man would stop or he wouldn't, and then he'd stop permanently. I told Farland to keep his mouth shut and watch his door. He told me to tell you so you could tell Robb so he could tell Luwin, and then Luwin could tell Farland that Farland was right already. We Greyjoys like a chain. Tell Farland I'll come by after dinner, Jon said. Tell him to give me something to do with my hands, so he doesn't think I'm there to tell him he doesn't know what he knows. Theon nodded, pleased with his own part in the flow of information, and went to bother someone else because he loved to be in the middle of middles. After dinner, when the house had settled into the quiet work of sitting with its grief and its order, Jon made his way to the kennels. The air there always held that warm, musky press of hounds and straw and the faint, friendly stink of old meat. Farland was a thick-bellied man, thick with competence. He rubbed a hound's ear while the dog leaned its whole trust into the hand. He grunted when he saw Jon. Then, to disguise the welcome, he made his voice come out like the scrape of a spade. "Someone's come by twice since the king left a morning," he said. "Not my men. Not a boy with no sense. Someone who knows how to walk with his feet and not his heels. Hounds don't lift their heads. They don't make a song of it, but they tense. I feel it in them the way I feel when a storm is under the hill but not yet risen." "What did he touch?" Jon asked. "Nothing," Farland said, which was the kind of answer that makes a man listen harder. "Nothing I can point to. Near Rickon's pen. Near the feed room as if to sniff it. No hand upon latches. No scratches where fools often leave their marks. Just a flavor. I saw a man in the corridor last night," Jon said, letting the words be simple. "He knew how to walk too." Farland grunted. "If you want to catch a man who knows how to walk, you must make him think he is teaching you to do it," he said. "Stand yonder when the moon is up as if you are a figure in a story who is told to stand there. Be stupid. He will come to you." "Come and watch with me," Jon said. "Stand where you cannot bear to stand. I will be stupid and you will be clever, and between us we will be enough like the world to make him show himself." Farland looked at him with that sudden, bright approval that men who are good at one thing give to someone who shows an aptitude for a parallel thing. "You will do," he said, which in Farland's mouth was like a title. They waited until the moon had lifted from the edge of the clouds and made a small, steady white. Farland told Jon to stand in the passage half between shadow and light, in full view of an arch that led to a small storage with nothing in it to interest a man unless he had a reason of his own. Ghost went flat to the ground, melted into shadow and patience. Farland took himself where Jon could not see him and became, by craft of long practice, a part of the smell and sound of the place. The wait was a lesson. Jon learned how long the night can be when you belong to it, how much weight the air has when you are spending your attention like coins and counting each clink. He learned the rhythm of hounds' breaths and how a rat's feet sound different from a man's smallest movement. He learned he could stand as long as his mind told his body what it was for, and then longer, perhaps an hour, perhaps 3. A figure unstitched itself from the dark where there had been only shadow before. Jon did not move his head. Ghost did not stir. The figure came as if it had been here before, and perhaps it had. It paused at the archway and turned its face toward him. Not startled, not even curious, just measuring. Jon let his mouth open a fraction, as if bored. He lifted a hand as if to scratch behind his ear in the way boys do when tired and done with their watch. The figure's shoulders lowered the smallest degree. It slipped through the arch. Farland moved like a winter fox. Jon heard the whisper of his sleeve, and that was all. Then a sound like breath being pushed out of a bag that did not belong to a man and did, and Farland's voice, ancient with triumph. "Ho! Now then." Jon stepped forward and Ghost flowed beside him. In the small storage, Farland had a man by the wrist with a twist that made the arm speak nonsense. The man's face was not a face Jon knew. He had the blandness men put on when they want to be no one in particular. The very lack of any distinguishing thing was itself a feature. He wore a knife where men who must use knives wear them. He wore a second at the back of his belt where men who do not trust their luck put them. His eyes were a winter creek, shallow, cold. "What do you want in a Kennels hall?" Farland asked, the rhetorical shape of the question telling the man that answers would be weighed even if given. "And what did you do the 2 nights prior when you thought only dogs saw and dogs don't tell tales?" The man's mouth moved into a smile the way a turtle's head emerges. Unwilling, testing the air. "I came for a dog," he said. "One can make good coin on a fine pup. There is a better place to steal what you cannot keep," Farland said, tightening the twist until the man's knees said what his mouth would not. "And you are not here for a dog." The man's gaze slipped toward Jon and then off again, as if striking a burr and refusing to take it with him. "I am here for a bed." he said in a different voice, and that was wrong in a way that made the hairs go up along Jon's arms. "No one sleeps in a room with no straw," Farland said. "You're either a bad liar or a bad thief, and either way a bad night." He slammed the man's wrist against the jamb, not cruelly, only enough to set a word in the bones, and then unhooked him from the hold with the certainty of someone who has learned that men who are caught are often less trouble than men who are only being caught now. "We'll take you to Jory, and we'll take what you carry to Luwin, and between the two of them the truth will be teased out and pegged on a line for all to see." Jon came forward and took the man's other arm. He felt restraint where a less trained hand would feel softness. Muscle that did not announce itself and control that had been trained in another man's yard. The man did not smell of the castle. He smelled of a dry place and then a wet one and then a dry again. A traveler, but not a far one. Jon kept his mouth still. He would not give the man the relief of hearing his own voice to anchor himself to. Jory did not waste time or words when they delivered the prisoner to him. He looked at the man the way a good hunter looks at a fallen thing, with care for the living still in it, with attention to how it might move if given a chance. "Who are you?" he asked, which is how it always begins. The man tried 4 names on his tongue and let them fall as if none tasted right. Jory said one name back to him that he had no right to know, and the man's eye flickered. "We'll call you that until we find better," Jory said. He had a clean way with men that did not rely on cruelty and did not relieve them either. "You'll sit until first light, and then Luwin will ask, and then Robb will decide whether to throw you out the gate or keep you for the way you know how to walk." "Throw me," the man said at once. "Throw me and I'll be gone beyond counting." "That's the trouble with men who can be gone," Jory said mildly. "They're often the ones we should keep an eye on." He nodded to Farland. "My thanks. If I were 20 again, I would say I heard him first. I'll say now that my ears are not what they were." Farland snorted. "Your ears are the same age as your patience. Both are longer than mine." He looked at Jon. "He'll come again," he said, and Jon knew he wasn't speaking of this man alone. Once they learn a path, they can't stop walking it. Jon stood a long moment by himself after, at the corner where the passage met open air, looking up at the stars pinned there like common things. Ghost pressed his shoulder against Jon's knee and made a sound without voice. The cold took his breath and gave it back. He went to find Robb and tell him without drama what had happened. Robb took the news carefully in his hands like a pot hot from the hearth. "We'll tell Luwin now," he said, "and we will not tell the house. Let the story be our own a day longer and see what comes out when it thinks no one is listening." He paused, thinking in that slow, sure way that had been his this last week. "If Jory returns tomorrow, as he says, we'll see whether our man smells of marsh or of something else." Farland thought marsh, Jon said. Or at least, he thought the man knew water. "Then Jory will know his feet," Robb said, and smiled without humor. "I am growing fond of the simple fact that if I do not know a thing, there is a man under this roof who does." The night lifted its weight and put it down elsewhere. Dawn came like a silver piece slid under a door, quietly, without flourishes. Jory and his men returned in the hour before noon, mud up to their thighs, rope burn on 2 wrists, a smell of cold that learned the hall's smell as they crossed it. They had the look of men who had kept themselves and one another from doing a foolish thing and were glad of it. Jory's mouth bent the smallest amount when he saw Jon and Robb together. "We found a track that left nothing for us to bless," he said, standing at the foot of the dais, not because he needed to, but because men understand where words take on their shape. Could have been 3, could have been 7 if the maker meant it so. Could have been one clever boy with too much time and a cut of raw meat to drag. "We found where the woman's shoe was not, where we last saw it. We found the boy who said coals and found him a boy telling a story to see how big he could make it with us in it. We found 3 sheep eaten the way hunger eats and not the way malice does. We did not find your monster. If he was there, he was too wise to leave us an autograph." "And the iron over the door?" Robb asked. "Old," Jory said. "Older than the woman's shoe, older than the boy. Someone's grandmother tied sickle ends along it and thought it would keep the night polite. It didn't, but it made her sleep. Jon watched the room's shape change with the report. Not relief exactly. More like the release of a held breath that a man did not know he was holding. Luwin noted the details with that small satisfied tap of his quill that meant he had learned a new thing or had an old one confirmed. "Good," Robb said. "We don't have to tell a story yet. We can still tell the truth. Eat and sleep and then write me what you would have written if you had been sent by a man who was not me." "Would it be a kinder letter?" Jory asked. "It would be shorter," Robb said. "Kindness in this house is often a matter of words we do not spend." There were more hours after that and more work. A house is always this. Letters that must be pushed out into weather and fed to birds and hope. Fences that lean and must be coaxed back into their old stamina. People with complaints that are really loneliness and must be addressed with the kind of justice that counts time as well as coin. Jon walked the yards with Robb and alone. He held his head so that men could see him if they chose to, and so that men could pretend not to see him if that made the business easier for them. He sat with Luwin and untied and retied tags and learned tea. He names of the white birds more surely than the names of southern lords. He watched Ghost and Grey Wind watch each other and learned that two wolves can hold an argument without moving anything but their ears. After the evening bread, before the torches all were lit, Arya slid into his path and out of it, as if she had been testing whether she could do that without being caught. He let her arrive beside him without comment because she was a creature who would talk when she felt like it and not an inch sooner. "Needle sleeps under my bed during the day and under my belt when Septa Mordane sends my mind somewhere else," she said, fierce with pride. "Lady pretends not to look at it. Grey Wind looked at it once and then decided not to again. Ghost looks at it and thinks about rabbits," Jon said. "He is refined. He wants small things slain cleanly." "Are your feet remembering what you told them?" "They are," she said. "Septa Mordane says my stitches are better because my hands learned a harder stitch." She wrinkled her nose. "She thinks she said a mean thing. She said a true thing. Sansa says I must not stab anyone at court. I told her I would not stab anyone who did not ask me to." "Do not stab anyone unless your heart has done all the other work first," Jon said. "The blade is the end of a long line of decisions. Do not skip to the end." Arya nodded solemnly as if he had advised her about how many bites to take from a pie. She ran off then because she was a girl who would always run off, and Jon watched her disappear into the line of shadow along the base of the inner wall as if she belonged there, and perhaps she did. The days fell into a rhythm that felt like the slow beat of a drum too far away to see. Jon liked it. He liked that the same tasks repeated differently, that the same men said the same words and meant new things with them. He liked the world when it did not require him to swing or be swung at. And all the while, the winter gathered itself, and the river put its skin on and took it off and put it on again, and letters went out and small answers came back, and ropes frayed and were mended, and the wolves grew and learned the castle steps the way a boy learns prayers by hearing them over and again even when he does not want to. He never forgot the man with many names and blandness like a cloak. Jory kept him where men cannot be forgotten and learned nothing he would swear to under the eye of a god. The man had a way of answering questions that was like watching a stream. You could tell yourself you saw through to the stones, but something in the surface always belonged to the air and not to you. Robb held him until keeping him taught them no more, then put him beyond the gate with a sack that held less than a purse and more than a stone, and men who shut the door after a release are always braver than those who move men about on a board. The man went and Jon watched him go. He did not think it was finished with that departure. He did not think of it too much either. You can bruise your mind by worrying old fruit. Jory's marsh grew quiet. The sheep were returned to their pen and kept there longer than they liked, and men grow bored of worrying after a time and then pretend they were never worried. Only Luwin held onto the thread of it with his neat fingers as if he meant to weave it into something later. He did not say as much. He did not need to. On a morning that came in with a sky like scraped bone, a raven blacker than usual for the contrast brought a southern hand. Luwin read, and his mouth made that tight line that meant the message fitted neatly into something he had not said aloud. He passed it to Robb, then to Jon. The king had gone on well enough a week, then had gone on badly. The road's mud had made jokes of their wheels, and the wheels had not laughed. Renly had found everything funny that men half his age do. The queen had been quieter and then less so. The hand seal at the bottom of the note was not yet Eddard's. It was the king's, with Eddard's words asking for a list of Winterfell's needs that ought to have been obvious to a man who had sat those halls a quarter century. Jon read it twice and then held it by the edge like a coin flicked from one finger to another. "He is not yet there, and already the South tries to make a story of him," Jon said. "Then we will make enough order here that he can answer the South with facts," Robb said. They drafted a list that did not apologize. It named what the house held and what it needed. It named men who could be spared and men who could not. It named wolves without naming them. It named the marsh. It did not name the man who had walked where he should not have. Luwin tied the tag that said urgent only in the code of those who needed it to, and they sent the bird. If the world had done as it ought, perhaps the next day would have been like the last. Instead, the night once again decided it had its own ideas. Ghost woke before Jon, and the sound he made was not a sound Jon had yet heard from him. It was not fear. It was not anger. It was something that lived under both and might be older than either. Jon sat up, his feet already finding his boots, his hand already finding the leather thong of his knife. He did not light a candle. The corridor had everything in it he needed. The cold that keeps men honest, the smell that tells when another man has been where he should not, the tiny noises houses make when they exhale. He heard nothing and then something. Not a footfall, not exactly. A pressure on the air meant to be less than air. Ghost had no interest in politeness. He was a pale streak before a thought finished forming, and then there was the kind of sound no human throat makes, a violent insistence that the quiet be rinsed away. Jon went toward it without yelling for men. He loved Jory and trusted him, but Jory was 3 halls away, and a voice cannot move faster than a wolf. The shape was at a door that should not be touched, and Ghost was at the shape with his teeth, and the shape had a knife and then didn't because the knife had become a useless memory of metal inside white jaws. The door opened to a room where heat pressed like a hand on the chest, and where Catelyn had sat so long the chair might have learned her shape as a ladle learns the hands that hold it. Summer's growl rolled up from under the bed like a storm sounding itself in a far valley. The man moved with training. He went down without looking, and the knife he had meant to use at a bed, he meant to empty, fluttered from him and under him and then out from him when Ghost shook his head as if playing with a rat. Jon saw the bone-handled thing that wasn't quite ordinary and put his boot on the man's wrist because that was the right ritual, and because rituals are what separate men from the animals that prevail without them. Catelyn made a sound that a mother makes only when the world tries to come and take her living work away, and she was at the man with her hands like any she-wolf is. But summer was faster and more assuredy, and men do not long live where summer and winter meet to do their work. By the time Jory came, half of Winterfell behind him with steel and sense and sleep still on their shoulders. The only question left to ask was one none of them would have an answer for that night. Who paid, who sent, who thought they could step into this place where old gods listen and not be answered? Robb's face had taken on that bone-deep pale that means a boy has had to enter a room where men are born or die without his choosing it. He put a hand on Jon's shoulder once and took it away as if the contact burned. Not because of disgust, but because it was an anchor he could not afford in that moment. Luwin did not move at once. He looked at the knife as if it were a word he could read. He did not touch it. Mikken came to look as well. Men who love work love tools and hate tools that tell lies. Catelyn sank with her breath still running hard and let her head fall forward and then back again as if keeping the inside of her skull from bursting. Then she stood, and the standing was an act of will more obvious than any Jon had seen in days. Summer licked Bran's limp hand once and lay with his head upon the bedstead, eyes open. Ghost stood with his chest high and his head lower, as if the room were a great thing he had tried to swallow and could not. The man who had come to kill was very still on the floor. He had in him the look of someone who expected to be rescued and hadn't been. The bone and steel of his knife had an artistry beyond his station. Jory took him away with 2 men and a rope. The sight of rope in a room like this made Jon's mouth taste of iron, and he spat into the fire, a small old habit meant to keep bad luck from taking root. When the room had been quieted and Catelyn had regained the seat she would not leave even for rage or righteousness, Luwin, calm and shaking under the calm, took the knife in his hand with careful fingers. "This is not a Winterfell blade," he said, "nor a bog knife. I have seen this work once only, in a knight's hand in a city where gold buys men's names." "King's Landing," Jon said, not to make a guess but to put a name to the sick shape that had appeared in the room. Ghost's head turned to him as if agreeing. Robb blew his breath out hard and looked older in the space of that breath. "Send a bird," Robb told Luwin. "Now. 2, 3. I don't care if the rookery looks like a torn cloud when you are done. Send to my father on the road, and then to White Harbor to ask whose ship has lately put into our needs, and then to Lord Manderley himself to ask if any man in his train carries work like this. Send to Lord Serwyn, to Lord Glover, to anyone who has kept the roads in his eyes these last weeks." "I will," Luwin said. He did not ask permission to carry the knife. He wrapped it in cloth and set it against his ribs as if it were a sentence he did not want to speak aloud lest it become truer for the saying. "Thank you," Catelyn said to Summer first, then to Ghost, the words scraping like stone. "Thank you," she said to the white wolf her son had chosen in a snowbank. She did not look at Jon. He did not require it. He stood, and after a while the standing meant the thing he needed it to. "I belong here, for now, when this house holds its breath." When the house slept, much later, with that unnatural alertness that follows fright, Jon went to the godswood and knelt because men need to set their knees down somewhere after a night of sharp edges. The air there was clean in a way that almost hurt. Ghost lay across the path with his nose on his paws. The heart tree did not weep or whisper. The pool did what water does. It remembered the sky and offered it back, false and true both. Jon said no words because there were none. He let his breath go ragged and then smooth and then ragged again. The face carved in the white bark looked down with its old grief. It had seen men with bones and bright eyes and knives. It had seen nights when stones moved. It would see this boy and this day and this slow decision to stay and call it nothing, because in the long length of things it was, and yet for Jon it was what there was. He felt in himself the certainty he had been making with his hands these last days settle into his spine like a short sword put in its place, and when he rose he placed his palms on the cold trunk and did not ask for anything except this, to know what he knew and not to call it by another name. He slept then, and in the morning woke already halfway to the counting room, which is one way to know a duty has made a home in you. Farland brought him a strip of leather with tooth marks in it and said Ghost had chewed the assassin's knife until the leather sang. Garth sent a boy to say the south wall of the glass gardens had held with straw and stubbornness and old curse words. Wexley came with numbers fewer than the last ones and steadier, and a face that had learned to be proud of telling the truth. Jory wrote the incident into his book with that tight hand so that later men would not have to ask old men what had happened but could read it and be satisfied or not, as their natures dictated. Robb came into the counting room in the hour after noon and closed the door behind him as if he meant to keep the world out and keep Jon in. He leaned his back to the wood and shut his eyes. For a moment he looked exactly as he had when he was a boy who had fallen from a horse and lay looking at the sky, not yet hurt enough to cry and not brave enough to laugh. Then he opened his eyes and the boy went where boys go when men begin. "We do not tell ourselves the story we like," Robb said. "We tell ourselves what happened. Men will say kings and queens and knives with handles too fine for common hands. We will say, a man walked where he should not, and wolves reminded him, and the woman who has sat longer than any of us would have stood had the wolves not moved. We will not be foolish in our fear. We will not be brave enough to be stupid. We will be exact." Jon nodded. The word exact had the right weight. "We will," he said. "And you?" Robb went on, a hand moving as if he meant to set it on Jon's shoulder and thought better, not because of pride, because of need. "You will sleep a while today, even if you have to knock yourself on the head with your own book. I require a right hand that has fingers that know what they are for." "I'll sleep," Jon said. "After I tell Luwin I want the ravens fed until their beaks shine. After I tell Wexley I saw his numbers and liked their new shape. After I tell Farland I stood where he told me and learned he was right." Robb's mouth twitched. "After that," he agreed. "Did you think I would give you leave to sleep first? We are Starks. We sleep last and least. Perhaps that is why we are often thin." Jon smiled, and it was a small, honest thing. In the days that followed, Winterfell did what houses must. It folded this new danger into the old ones and made room for it at the table. Luwin's birds flew more often. Jory's men watched the posterns with their hands on their straps. The stable doors were secured with a cleverness that would have made a thief weep for a simpler life. Catelyn's vigil did not soften. When she refused to rest, she refused without rage. She refused the way a burned place refuses to be touched. Reflex, fact. Sansa wrote a letter that said nothing and everything to a friend whose father ran the kitchens in the castle at White Harbor. She penned it with care and did not cry until the last period. Arya ran and learned to keep her blade quiet when she moved, which is a thing no one can teach fully to anyone except a girl to herself. Rickon learned to stand in the doorway and then to choose, and sometimes he chose the room and sometimes he chose the hall, and no one told him that one choice was better. Ghost slept in the corridor outside Jon's door most nights, and sometimes under Jon's bed and once on it, which made the rushes cool to the back for days. And the kingdom beyond their walls went on being itself without their permission. The rivers would thaw and freeze again. Men would ride south into a tangle of men like themselves and come to think it normal. Eddard would put his hand to the work of the king and not complain aloud. Letters would come and go and sometimes bring truth with them and sometimes not. Jon would go a morning without thinking of the wall, and then an evening would come and a wind with it, and for a breath he would imagine a ridge white as a bleached bone and a line of men in black small against it, and he would see that he was not there and feel the two truths, what is, what might have been, set a little weight across his shoulders. And he would take that weight and add it to the rest and straighten with it, a man learning to be the right hand to another man who was learning, too. Catelyn's hands were bound up to the wrists the next day, the linen clean at morning and brown at evening, and clean again at morning because servants who loved her could not bear to see the stain. The bandages made her look less vulnerable and more like a woman armoring herself with what she had. She did not complain when Osha changed the wrappings. She did not thank her either. She sat, and the sitting had purpose in it. When she spoke to Robb and Luwin, she spoke as if the words had been waiting all night and she had weighed each one with her thumbs so it would not tip the sentence over. "I'll go to King's Landing," she said, and the room's heat made a small surge as if to answer her. "This knife is not a thing to be named in a letter. If I put it in a raven's beak, I put it in a dozen men's pockets before it reaches your father's hand. I will carry it. I will tell him. I will do it quietly and I will come back." Robb was very still. He did not look at her hands. He looked at her mouth because that is where the truth comes out if it is coming at all. "You will not go alone," he said. "Roderick will go," she said. "He is old enough to be thought less than he is, and he has been a knight long enough to be thought more. He knows which road not to take before he thinks of which road to take." "And your hands?" Luwin said to ask the question Robb would not. "They will heal," Catelyn said, and her eyes did something under their lids that was not tears and not refusal of tears. "There is nothing the South can conjure that will make them hurt more than they do now. I will wrap them and hold the reins, and if the gods wish, they'll give me back my fingers with feeling in them. If they do not, I'll make do. This is not a matter of comfort." Jon stood by the window slit and said nothing. He had no place in that exchange except the space he has in all such moments, to hear the weight of what must be done and to know which thing to carry away and which to leave. She did look at him once. Not long, not as men look at a thing they have made and approve, not as women look at a thing they fear might be taken. She looked to take the measure of the obstacle he represented, and finding he would not stand in her path, she went by him as if he were stone that had always been there. It was not unkind. It was not kindly. It was exact. Roderick shaved his whiskers down to the bristle that meant riding and tied back his hair with a string that had once held a falconer's lure. He came to the yard to choose their horses and spoke as softly as if he were in the rookery. "2 cloaks only," he told Catelyn in that voice that believed in the sense of simple things. 2 men and not a train. We will be fewer than the words men might think to say about us. That is how we arrive where we intend. They left by the Hunter's Gate, not by the King's, and the road took them as it had taken Benjen. Smaller and then idea and then story. Robb watched until he could not see them. He did not wave. Waving is for boys on wharfs and men on walls who think their arms can tie ropes to those who are leaving. He stood until his breath lost its shape in the cold, and then he turned and came back into the work as if it had been waiting with its sleeves rolled up. The house changed again. The absence of a mother is less loud than the absence of a king and more. Sansa's steps sounded different on the stone because there was no woman to look at her just so when she took them wrong. Septa Mordane gathered the younger girls and spoke of stitches and queens as if one bore any real relation to the other beyond needles and patience. Arya was a hole in the room you noticed more for its shape. Rickon learned new mischiefs because old Nan had to sleep sometimes and boys take that as a dare. Jon found himself standing in a door he had not known exist. Ed until Catelyn's leaving opened it, to go into Bran's room without feeling as if he had crossed a line made in blood. He went in at the hour when Luwin made a count of breaths because Luwin believed in the comfort of numbers even when they meant nothing to gods. Summer lay under the bed as before, and the rhythm of his breathing had, to Jon, become a clock for a house that had forgotten time. Jon told Bran a thing as he did now whenever he came. Simple, small, what he had done that day with his hands, as if the story might be a thread Bran's mind could take hold of and follow back. "We mended the court's south bench," he said. "It had a wobble that made old men unwilling to sit. It wasn't the wood. It was the flagstone under it. We leveled the stone and the bench thinks it was the bench we fixed. Ghost chased 2 mice and let one go on purpose. The one he kept he did not eat. He looked at me and then at the mouse and then back at me as if he had remembered you liked to put them in jars and see how clever they were at getting out. There was no answer. There was, as there always was, the sense that saying a thing makes it more true. He stayed until Summer's ear flicked his goodbye for him. The letter from the south came on the 3rd day, carried not by a raven but by a man on a piebald mare whose breath smoked harder than the horses. He was one of Lord Serwyn's, and he brought the king's new stories. That on a bright, annoyingly perfect morning on the king's road, the prince had been bit by a wolf and more grievously by his own pride. That a butcher's boy who knew little of princes and less of mercy had been hunted down by a dog in a helm and returned to the queen's good grace as if he were a sack to be set down. That at dusk, when the day was tired of holding all that foolishness, a lord had killed a girl's wolf by lantern, light because there was no other wolf to lay upon the queen's anger. The man told it in a flat way as men do when the events themselves have taken all the colors already. He left out much and left in enough. Robb's face was first blank, then terribly pale, then something else that made Jon set a hand on the table as if the wood would steady him. The room tightened around the news the way a strap tightens around a load. "Lady," Robb said after a long moment. "The quiet one." Jon swallowed. "Ned would have done it himself," he said, "because it mattered even if it fixed nothing. He would have made it clean. He would not have handed it to another man to relish. He shouldn't have had to do it at all," Robb said in a voice that sounded like a young man learning what it means to be angry and to keep the anger in the right place. "But he did it because she demanded it and because he will always choose the place where his honor lives, even if that place is a knife. It will not be easier for him in the south," Jon said. "He has gone to a court where men make honor into a story they tell to children. He will be very fierce and very tired." Robb nodded. He turned the seal in his fingers and came to a resolution the way he always did. You could see it settle in his eyes like a tired bird choosing a branch. "We will write to Sansa," he said. "We will not put blame where it will turn to poison in her cup. We will say that Winterfell stands with her. We will say that Lady runs here now in the snows and is fed on rabbit and the leavings of nobles. Lies told for kindness are a salve or a rot. We'll take the chance that this will be a salve." Jon did not disagree. Some lies are boats built for one crossing. On that same day, as if the world had decided to pour its events through one narrow mouth, a small party rode under the broken-tooth arch at the west. The lead horse went with its head a little high, ears pricked as if the air carried a riddle only it could hear. Tyrion Lannister sat there with the careless care of a man whose spine knows saddles better than benches. His cloak was the renegade kind, one that had forgotten what house it had meant to honor and now only served its master against the weather. Beside him a black-haired man with a sly grin handled a mule laden with bundles. Behind them 2 guards who looked bored and alert in equal measure. Tyrion swung down with a cat's economy. He took in the yard in one glance and bit back the sort of smile he might have offered had no one been watching who would dislike it. He found Jon with that ease of his, a man who always knows where the interesting things keep themselves. "Is this the part where I am pelted with snow for being a Lannister?" he asked, jovial. "Only if you wish to be warmed," Jon said. He found he felt something like relief at seeing the man. There are people who carry with them the possibility of conversation that is neither flatter nor threat. Tyrion was one. "I come bearing a gift," Tyrion said, and did not reach into his cloak with a flourish because he knew where he stood. "Do you have a boy here who loved horses enough to anger gravity?" Jon felt, as always when Bran's name hovered, the familiar fragile thing inside of him move. "We do," he said, "and he still loves them. He will again." Tyrion snapped his fingers to the man with the mule, who opened one bundle then another, bringing out drawings, creased but not smudged. He laid them on the trough, weighting the edges with stones because the heir loved to meddle. "A saddle for a boy who sits without legs," Tyrion said. "An ingenious thing that was described to me wrongly by 2 men, and then properly by a woman who had never seen a horse and yet had borne 4 children. I have drawn what her good sense told me. I have also drawn which leather to use and which to avoid because it stretches as a lie. Mikken has the hands for the metal. Hullen will mutter and then nod." Robb had come by then, drawn by the shape of the scene as much as by the man in it. He looked at the drawings and his eyes went clever and bright with hope and skepticism. "And this will not throw him like a sack," he said. "This will let him ride like a prince if he chooses to be one," Tyrion said. "It will also teach him to fall in a way that will not make his arms remember pain more than joy. Tell him this, he will not be what he was. No man is. But he will be something more than what the bed tells him he must be." He looked up and, because he was not a fool, softened his voice. "I'm no friend to the South, no matter whose coin I spend. I will like it if one thing I did on that road becomes a thing that does not make me tired to recall." Robb's hand went to the plans and flattened them as if to press them into existence. "We'll start now," he said. "If there is a piece we can finish before he wakes, I'll set it by his bed. He will see it when he opens his eyes and know the world is waiting for him not with pity but with a bridle." Tyrion's mouth did a small, honest thing. "I'll drink to that," he said, and Theon, who had been hovering with the air of someone who expected to disapprove, found his face betraying him with something like admiration. They crowded into the armory, and for a while the heat in there was different from the winter heat. It had purpose and the ring of tools taking metal out of what wants to be stone. Mikken grunted once and then did not waste his breath on words. He ran his fingertip along the drawing and hissed where it would bite and nodded where it would cradle. Tyrion stood back and did not interfere, a rare and generous restraint. Jon fetched the leather lewin used for mending straps in the rookery and the longer strips Hullen kept for reins and the stout hooks from the bin of odds whose lids always stuck. Grey Wind nosed at the plans and regarded them as unworthy of killing. Ghost sat, patient, eyes on Tyrion as if no one had told him that this was a man who could wear and take off a smile with as much ease as a cloak. At some point Gage sent in a platter with bread and slices of smoked beef that had the good salt in them. They ate standing, hands greasy, faces focused as boys before a pond in summer. Tyrion chewed and swallowed and then said, with the air of a man who has kept silent as courtesy and feels he has paid his dues, "The king is not improved by travel." "We have heard," Robb said. His voice was carefully neutral. "We heard of the wolf and the boy with the wooden sword. And the queen." Tyrion's eyes flicked, measuring depths. "Then you have heard of the dog," he said softly. "If there is a hell for men who do as they are told too well, Sandor Clegane will find it well lit." He took a drink of the small beer someone had pushed into his hand. "And you have heard that your father performed a kindness for the queen's anger." "We have," Jon said. "He did it with his own hands," Tyrion said. "You may tell that to anyone who looks at you as if the North breeds only wolves and not men who will keep for themselves the ugly things which must be done." There are not enough men like that in any kingdom. Robb swallowed what might have been a reply. He bent again over the plans. Tell me about this strap, he said to Mikken. If it is the wrong leather, it stretches and he will pitch forward at a trot. We won't have him pitch forward at a trot. We won't, Mikken said, and the conversation went back to a kind of work that could be finished and held up and admired. Tyrion did not tarry, for all his pleasure in his own usefulness. He had the look of a man being pulled by strings southward and northward both and finding it ridiculous. He slept one night in the tower set aside for guests the house did not know how to place. He made Luwin laugh once in the rookery. He showed Rickon how to deal himself a hand of knucklebones even though no one wins at knucklebones properly. He petted Ghost exactly once and did not try again. In the morning, he collected his man and his mule and made the goodbye that was not a goodbye and rode out under a sky so clear it made the world look like a new-made thing. The work on the saddle made a kind of joy in the days that followed. Mikken, who loved difficulty like a chest loves locks, treated it as a riddle. Hullen, who loved horses more than any man, let his usual gruffness become tenderness around the notion that a boy who could not feel his legs would yet feel a horse under him. Osha came from the glass gardens to tell them how to bend leather so that it would not remember its old shape. Garth brought a wedge of ash and said it would do for the stiffeners if they couldn't wait for the white oak from the river. Even Wexley, who had learned to keep his column straight, came and stood as men do when they have done nothing useful to the task but want to be near it in case it needs a hand. Robb folded bits and pieces into his visits to Bran the way one folds a treat into a child's pocket when he pretends to be stern. He left a bit of leather one day, an iron buckle the next, a drawing of a ring. He did not say the word saddle. He did not have to. The room began to smell of oiled leather and iron in the way that only the best rooms smell. Luwin tolerated it because he saw what it did to Robb's back, the way it straightened under hope without letting hope become presumptuous. In the nights, Jon sometimes returned to the corridor by the Kennels, remembering Farland's sly counsel. Nothing came. The watcher they had caught, the Bland Man, had been led outside the walls in the hour before dawn along with 3 men whose task it was to follow him. He slipped them after one turn in the winter town like a fish that decides it was never in the net. Jory came back with his mouth thin and said he would remember the man's gait if he saw it at the edge of his grave. Jon thought the same. He also thought that sometimes letting a man go sets a line that he will cross again, and when he does, you know exactly where to stand to meet him. If that was ill luck or good sense, he would know later. A week after Tyrion left, a bird arrived with small black eyes full of insolence that made Luwin chuckle. It bit him as promised before surrendering its tie. The note in Benjen's hand had few words, all arranged like stones that do not slip. They were at the wall. The road had behaved the way roads behave when watched by men who have learned to be surprised only by the obvious. The recruits were a sorry lot, and the wall would make them sorrier and better. He did not say he missed Jon. He did not say he did not. He did say, in a small line at the bottom that might have been a joke or might have been a prayer, that the north feels closer when a man stands on true north. Jon sat with the note and felt a quiet that had nothing to do with the springs or with Luwin's hearth. He put the paper under his mattress not because he feared for it but because it felt right that he should sleep on something a man he loved had written. There were visitors, as there always are when a king's shadow has fallen upon a house and been drawn away. A petty lord from Barrowton came with a complaint that took 2 days to tell and took 1 page to solve. A woman from Wintertown brought a baby with a cough and the fear in her eyes that says sorrow has already been counted for and paid in advance. Luwin taught her to put mustard on cloth and boil it until it said yes in the air, and she went away lighter in the step, because of hope as much as because of the mustard. Theon gambled and won and lost and took both as if they were compliments, which in a way they are for men like him. Hallis Malin broke up a fight in the yard between a boy who thought his father had been insulted and a man who had, in fact, insulted the boy's father. Robb took the man aside and gave him work. He took the boy aside and gave him a punishment that felt like honor and not humiliation. Jon watched and learned the part where you give a man a thing to do if you do not intend to give him a thing to hit. On a cold, bright noon they carried the first of the saddle pieces to Bran's room. Not the whole shape, only the part that would ride under his thighs and take the weight of a future. Mikken came in his best jerkin, which was worse than his worst for the armory. And Hullen came with hands he had washed so hard the skin was pink and tender. Robb set the piece at the foot of the bed as if he were setting a child down. Luwin stood with his hands behind his back, because he did not trust them not to fidget. Catelyn was not there. She was on the road, a bead sliding along a string none of them could hold. The room was quieter without her grief in it. Summer lifted his head and then laid it down again, having done his part in keeping a promise that is older than the house. Bran did not open his eyes. He did not touch the leather. They left the room exactly as they had found it, with one more idea resting in it to catch the light. A day later, a raven came with a jagged, impatient hand in a neat circle of seal. Roderick's, stolen from his own mind by habit. They had crossed the neck by ways that made even the old man's stomach protest. They had passed men who tried not to be seen and had seen them anyway. They were in a place where island men held the causeways like lines in a game and found it amusing to demand tolls in riddles. They would be in White Harbor within 2 days if the Gate of the Twins did not make them wait out of spite, and then on a ship northward to a city that had forgotten winter except as a story. "Let them go," Robb said after he read it twice. "We cannot put our hands on the ends of their path. We can only hold this end steady." Jon went that evening to the marsh Jory had told him of in his plain, unexcited way. He took Grey Wind with him at Robb's urging because the wolf would go if Robb breathed the thought, and took Ghost because Ghost would go anyway. Jory came because a man who has seen a place once should see it again if he is to speak of it in future without lying. The reeds were brittle under frost and made a music like broken glass when the wind had its way. They found the circle where a fire had not quite been, and the place where the prince multiplied like excuses, and the bank where good earth began and then decided to stop. Jon stood with his hands in his sleeves and felt the odd hesitancy there, as if a story had been begun and then abandoned for a better one. "If it were men," he said, "we'll see them again. Men like this use a place until the place stops giving, and then they move and come back when it forgets who they are. If it were not men," Jory said, "we'll see it again too, because things that aren't men are worse at remembering what is good for them than men are." "Speak for yourself," Theon said, who had insisted upon coming because the idea of a mystery annoyed him. "I am excellent at repeating mistakes." Grey Wind stood on the good earth and raised his nose and then lowered it. Ghost stood with one paw on the threshold and then stepped back. Jon watched that tiny, wordless debate and added it to his ledger of what the world is. By the time they returned, the last light had slid behind the kicked-over black shapes of the trees along the west wall, and the house was already closing the shutters like eyelids. Jon went with Robb to the counting room and walked Wexley through the new tally, and then he sat at the end of the bench and let the ink dry on the last note to Lord Glover about the lumber that would have to wait until the river lifted its skin. He considered sleeping there, because sometimes the body tells the truth even when the mind harps about the appearance of things. Ghost nudged his knee. He went to his bed. He woke before dawn with the gray already inside the room, and the sound that roused him was not footfall or door but the river belly bellowing at its own ice. The kind of noise that wakes men who live near rivers the first time every year and then becomes a thing they stop hearing. For Jon it was new enough to find beautiful. He dressed by habit and went to the yard while the men who slept near the fires shifted like sacks to a new side. He found Hodder there, standing with his hands at his sides the way he did when he was waiting for someone to tell him who he was for the next hour. Jon smiled at him and Hodder smiled back with one of those simple joys that make a mockery of any southern man's idea of sophistication. "Hodder," he said with pride. "Hodder," Jon agreed solemnly and put into the word, "Good morning. Draw water with me. We'll carry it here. After that, to Garth. After that, you will help Mikken if he asks, and you will love the work because it is heavy." Hodder nodded, and in that nod was the economy of men who do not need to tie every thought with string. Rumor goes where birds do not. By noon, an old fellow from Wintertown who sold buttons had come to the yard and told Theon a story that Theon told 3 men and then told Jon because Jon is a cup men try to empty their stories into to see if the bottom is sound. At the Crossroads Inn, a small river of travelers had mingled recently, and among them one Catelyn Stark had named herself in a room of strangers and claimed men for her purpose as if they had been sown there for her to harvest. She had laid hands on Tyrion Lannister with the authority of the trident behind her and told him he was accused and under her keeping. She had turned the tables and made the room listen. The man had laughed once as if this was what his life meant to be, interesting up to the point where it might be fatal. Jon listened. He felt something inside him that was not entirely dismay and not entirely pride. Robb read it in his face when he told him, because the two of them had learned each other like a field you walk in all weathers. "She will take him to the Eyrie," Robb said, mind already a few mile. "South down the road most men could not see. It is the road she knows. She will think the height will keep harm at the foot of the mountain. She will think Lisa remembers what is owed. I do not think the Lannisters will think kindly of it. I do not think the Lannisters will think kindly of anything outside their own mind." Jon said nothing for a beat because the old habit in him wanted to be careful with any sentence that had a Lannister for its subject. "Tyrion gave us Bran's saddle," he said finally, as if that complicated everything and therefore explained nothing. "It does," Robb said. He was not a boy, not for that moment. He was a small Winterfell that spoke, a set of stones that had learned language. It changes nothing, and it changes everything. Both can be true. What matters is what we do now. "What will we do?" Jon asked, not because he did not know, but because saying it aloud makes a rope of it that two men can hold. "We will prepare," Robb said, with no call to banners and no swagger. "We will speak to our men as if the summer will hold, and we will set the stores as if it will not. We will write to Lord Umber and Lord Karstark and Lord Manderley and Lord Serwyn, and we will say that Winterfell is a door on its hinges and not a barred gate. We will ask them for nothing and remind them of everything. We will put iron to our leather and oil to our iron. We will make sure the boys sleep in the barracks 2 nights a week so they remember which side of the spear point their hands belong to. We will not say Lannister. We will not say war. We will say the North does what the North does." Jon felt it then, the slow swell of the thing that had lived in his chest since he had set his hand on the root at the heart tree that cold morning. Not pride, not quite. Not ambition, not at all. The thing you feel when you have put your shoulder to a weight and, for the first time, the weight moves under your press. He nodded. He said the only word a right hand should say at such a moment. "Aye." He went to the armory and stood with Mikken a time and talked not of swords but of hinges, the small ones on the caskets where men put letters to be remembered and forgotten both, and the larger ones on the cellars where grain waited and mice schemed. He went to Garth and stood in the heat and breathed the green air because it steadied him. He went to Luwin and sat while the maester read back to him the letters they would send and took out 2 words because they boasted and added one because it reminded. He went to the practice yard and took a blade and moved until his arms shook and his breath scraped, and Ghost watched with that fond contempt wolves have for human efforts. That night he walked the wall and thought of Tyrion's laughter at the inn, of Catelyn naming herself in a room full of men who did not know they would be hers if she chose. He thought of Jaime's face like a polite mask and the Queen's eyes the color of cold coins and of Ned's hand on a collar. He thought of Benjen's short line and the mess in a marsh. He thought of the way Grey Wind had stepped forward and Ghost had stepped back at the Earthbank, and which of those instincts would keep a man alive and which would make him something else. Snow came in thin skins upon the stones, not the deep drifts that bury and undo, but a covering that made Winterfell itself again. The hot springs breathed their mist patient. The godswood's leaves made their small song. The wolves learned another circle of the yard and then another. Jon stood where he belonged for now. Shoulder to stone, hand to rope, ear to men, his breath showing him alive in the air. The night did not answer his thoughts. It did not need to. The work would answer them in the morning.